Hello everyone, I am Leviathan, and welcome to the Deep. So I want to go ahead and reach out to everybody and say, before I get started, I just want to say thank you to everybody that's listening. This entire project has been in the works for a very long time, and this episode in particular even is 8 months in the making, only because of a lot of things that have happened in my life, and I think we're just going to go ahead and get into it. Before we get started, I want to go ahead and get into why I chose to make mind control and manipulation the first episode, especially because it's going to follow a much different format than most of the stuff that's going to be on the series. And so I kind of want to just get into that for a second. I was raised to embody and manifest the greater good in pretty much every way that I could. And I kind of strived to do that my whole life, and to see just beyond people's mistakes and to believe in people's potential. And as I aged out of adolescence, especially in the last couple of years, many people started to exploit me and my goodwill. And a lot of those people were people that I loved and trusted. And when you put your love and your trust into somebody and they take advantage of you, you slowly start to lose trust in others, and you start to lose trust in yourself as well. And eventually there reaches a point where there's actually no one left you can trust. And if you can't trust anyone else and you can't trust yourself, then what can you even believe at some point, right? Because anything you say or hear could just be used to manipulate you. And that's actually my experience. In a lot of ways, deep down, I'm very wounded. And I sought to bring out the best in people, and I was crippled for it. And I tried to manifest the greater good in some people that I loved and cared about, and I was robbed of everything I had. And I would say that I really don't even know who I am anymore because I'm too scared to reach out and try a lot of things or even trust anyone. And Leviathan's Deep is my attempt to change all of this and to start to turn all of the experiences that I've had and some of my friends and people that I know personally, as well as other people in the world, and turn their experiences into something meaningful and something that we can all learn from and have benefit in, you know? I want to go ahead and say that if you're somebody that's in a narcissistic, emotionally harmful relationship or friendship or anything like that, I want to let you know that you're not alone. And I am not a social worker or a counselor or a psychologist or a therapist. I am just like another scarred person, but I really want to help, and I want to do something with all of the experiences I've had, and I want to pour them out to the world in a way that could benefit other people. Because if I could prevent the things that have happened to me from happening to somebody else, that would be the best start to rebuilding a meaningful life that I can ask for right now. This first episode about mind control is going to focus on fully understanding many of the different ways humans can be manipulated, but also how we can eventually become stronger than our circumstances. This episode is going to be a deep dive. So what this means is we're going to start at a surface level, but the longer this episode goes on, the deeper we're going to go until we start to get to the really, really deep stuff. There's going to be a lot of stories, a lot of information, and a lot of facts on our journey, and some of these are going to seem totally unbelievable. There's going to be a lot of emotions, a lot of intrigue, silliness, curiosity, confusion, and stuff. But eventually, those are going to give way to a great sense of concern and eventually terror. I want to leave a content warning for everyone at the bottom because things are going to become very, very disturbing and horrifying. And I would not recommend going to sleep to any of this stuff. If you struggle with any of the themes that I get into in the future, or any themes involving violence, abuse, or anything, don't feel pressure to make it all the way to the end. So while it is going to get incredibly crazy, there is a meaning to all of it. The last thing before we get started, I want to go ahead and give a very, very basic, broad description and definition of what I'm calling mind control here, because it makes a big difference as we go deeper. Mind control, for the purposes of this episode, is the hijacking or takeover of one individual's mind by another. Mind control affects the logic, emotions, and critical thinking of the person or the people in question. Both the intention and depth of this hijacking can vary greatly, from open experimentation to downright manipulation. The individual being hijacked may or may not recognize that they're even being controlled depending on the circumstances. And while neuroscience plays a great factor in this subject, For the purposes of this deep dive, we're just going to focus specifically on stories, phenomenons in psychology, sociology, and some communication theory. Let's go ahead and dive in. We're going to go ahead and start at our first depth, which is the power of suggestion. The topics we're going to discuss here are all very basic suggestive attempts to manipulate and control people. These are what we could consider to be gentle experimentation, and there's very little, if any, malicious intent. The 4 topics we're going to talk about here are hypnosis, induction, some effects of both, and then the placebo effect. Since mind control at the most basic level could be looked at as hypnosis, that's where we're going to go ahead and get started. So hypnosis, as you've usually seen, like in pop culture and stuff, if you think of it kind of like that, you are getting sleepy kind of thing with like a pendulum swinging, that's essentially the kind of hypnosis we're talking about. That really silly idea that like a pendulum or like a watch or something swung in front of your face. That's where we're basically going to go ahead and get started. Now, the funny thing is that it's more mysticism and mysterious than real research. There's been research done, but really nothing has ever come to fruition from it. A lot of the stuff that we know about hypnosis was pioneered by James Braid in the early 19th century, and a lot of his findings came before Freud. So we didn't really have a good fundamental understanding of modern psychology at the time, right? We do see some evidence that it worked in some ways, but the problem is that the scientific method wasn't really well used and utilized during the time. So it's not really something that we consider to be effective today. Different researchers have defined their ways of what hypnosis is. So I'll give a couple examples of that. So French psychologist Pierre Janet defined hypnosis as dissociative, meaning that it was more general detachment from emotions and from senses and stuff like that. Andre Weizenhofer viewed hypnosis more in terms of suggestibility, where it was more about participants becoming increasingly susceptible to other people's influence. William Edmiston saw hypnosis as mere relaxation, but then several researchers, including Michael Nash, viewed hypnosis as actually a state of regression, where individuals actually revert to a previous state of ego. So you could kind of think of it as if you had a backed up hard drive or something like that, and you know how you use Time Machine to back up. Regression, which was later actually discovered and sort of coined by Sigmund Freud, it happens as a defense mechanism when an individual cannot adapt to their current situation. Now, obviously, I don't know if I would say I believe that any of this stuff is scientifically backed, but this is just some of the research that's been done. Now that we have a pretty decent understanding of what hypnosis is, there's the process of actually becoming hypnotized, which we would call induction. Now, you know the idea of putting the pendulum between somebody's eyes. James Braid is the guy that basically designed this, and it's called the upwards and inwards squint, where the patient basically gazes at an object that's just hung right in front of their eyes, and they're basically told, just focus on this one thing. Now later, Dave Ellman designed the Ellman induction, which was actually used to prepare patients for surgery. He told the patient to lie down and close their eyes and imagine that their eyes are so relaxed that the harder they try to open them, the harder it becomes to open them. Finally, he would tell the patient to imagine clouds with numbers on them and count the numbers on those clouds as they passed by. This would continue until the patient was too tired to count anymore. That's definitely a lot more believable, and that doesn't really strike me as hypnotic per se. That's just kind of a sweet thing to do to somebody, but I mean, you got to take it where you can get it, I guess. Now, where it gets kind of funny is with rapid inductions, which are just kind of funny, and I recommend looking these up later. But these techniques are designed to rapidly cause a state of confusion with the patient, with the goal of bringing the subconscious mind to the forefront very quickly. And the efficacy of these is not very clear cut, if at all. There's 2 I'm going to talk about. One is called the handshake induction, which is essentially where you go to reach out for a handshake and the hypnotist just grabs the person and pulls them towards them. And if you see a video of this online, it's really funny. But the idea is that when you do this, you're causing the person's subconscious to just immediately surface, at which point they are the most susceptible to hypnotic induction, I suppose. It's kind of silly. The other one is the confusion induction, which is essentially to have somebody do something very challenging, like singing Happy Birthday backwards. Then when they start to do so, and they're struggling to do the task, maybe count prime numbers or something, right? The hypnotist will tell them to just sleep, and they'll do that or whatever sleep thing. while they're in the middle of this really challenging task. And the goal is supposed to be that they're at such a cognitive overload that the subconscious just goes, oh, okay. And it uses that person's like command as like a way of escaping the moment. It's very comedic to see something like this happen live. I have no idea if this works, but it's very silly to picture doing something like this. Now, regarding the efficacy of hypnosis, it's really challenging to know if it works or anything. There has been research done that suggests that irritable bowel syndrome has been potentially cured in some cases by hypnosis, but I don't really know how effective that is when there are other strategies to do that. And there's other things that people have tried to do, like using hypnosis as like the back burner. So like, for instance, there's hypnopedia, which is the idea that you like go to sleep and you can like listen to like a book in your sleep and you're going to learn while you're sleeping. It's like sleep learning, which we're pretty confident doesn't work at all. The other one is past life regression, which is the idea that you can retrieve memories from a past life while you're hypnotized. Yeah, there's not a lot of success stories with that, and it's pretty inconclusive. So I would not put a lot of efficacy into this. Now, given this is about the power of suggestion, I want to just really briefly touch on the placebo effect because it's the most commonly understood one. Everybody knows the placebo effect just because of how it essentially works. And what's very interesting is that there has been some evidence to suggest that it works, the placebo effect. So if a doctor doesn't really want to prescribe an actual medicine to a patient that's having something like IBS or vice versa, there has been evidence that doctors have prescribed like fake medicine, just like almost like sugar tablets. And the sugar tablets have actually been successful because the doctor makes it very clear that these tablets are supposed to cure it, and then it cures it, which is really fascinating. But the thing is, it's not particularly ethical because these people are not consensual in the act. It's unwitting. They have no idea that this isn't actually medicine. And so situations like these are pretty dicey, and this is why we don't really see this done nearly as often today. So we're going to go ahead and move on to our next depth. So the next depth is strange social phenomena. Now, most of the concepts and topics that we're going to be talking about here relate to the field of psychology and communication theory. Now, I'm going to do my best to identify where these ideas come from, but generally speaking, it's within those two categories. Now, this depth is going to focus solely on social interactions between people and groups in which the group itself is actually the hijacker, not any one person. Now, these phenomena are not necessarily malicious or intentional. It's just situations where groups end up hijacking people within the group or people even outside the group coming in. Some of the cases we're going to talk about have been documented extensively just because of their strangeness. And like I said, morally, these tend to be pretty benign just because they end up occurring either naturally or just through unintended means. The first topic I'm going to talk about here is called a complex adaptive system. So a complex adaptive system is a dynamic network of social interactions that adapts to the behavior of the people within it, but it moves entirely on its own and it's not necessarily predictable. Now, that may seem really confusing, but the thing is, I'm going to get into all three examples of complex adaptive systems. And as I do so, I want you to think about how your mind would work in these situations. These three examples are the stock market, social media echo chambers, and then political parties. So we're going to go ahead and get into the stock market first. Now, the U.S. stock market has been studied for a very, very long time. But like I said, we're only looking at this from the context of mind control and the way that people interact within a system, right? Once you start looking at the behavior of individuals in comparison to the group, that's when things start to get a little bit weird, right? Most people that buy stock, what they do is they just go to a financial advisor, say, make me money, and then the financial advisor goes out and buys all the stocks, and then people don't really pay attention. But the thing is that people that are either individual investors or brokers or vice versa, when people actually get invested in the stock market and they know these companies, things start to get a little bit weird. And if you're into the stock market, you're going to kind of know what I'm talking about here. I'm going to use a really good example from the pandemic, which is actually Zoom. So when the pandemic happened and everything crashed and collapsed, one of the biggest companies that happened on the planet was actually Zoom. And what's really funny as well, by the way, is the wrong ticker for Zoom went up. I don't know if anybody knows this, but if you type in Zoom into the stock market, it's not actually the right company. It's ZM. I'm pretty sure ticker ZM. But in any case, why did it shoot up? At a very basic level, it's sort of this thought process of like, well, since we're all using Zoom, people are just going to start buying the Zoom stock, right? So I should buy Zoom since people are going to be buying it very soon because we're all using the company and we're using its services. Now, at a slightly more advanced level, for people that are like in the stock market, you might say, well, since we're all using Zoom right now, Zoom as a company is going to become more valuable since it has very good enterprise business solutions, right? So it's going to be very profitable in the future. But then at a very deep level, what actually even determines Zoom's stock price to begin with? Because I know it's supply and demand, but in some sense, it's actually the proactive assumption of assuming that other people are going to behave in a certain way. So it's like, we're all using Zoom right now. And so, Zoom must be really valuable, like coming up in the next couple months. So we're just going to go buy it preemptively. And then everybody decides to buy it preemptively. And so Zoom just spikes up because we all assume it's going to be valuable during the pandemic. Behavior in this way then subsequently causes that initial behavior that we expect to come to fruition. So it's kind of like, which comes first, the chicken or the egg? It's kind of weird. We're going to go ahead and back up a little bit and move on to our next topic, social media echo chambers. So a social media echo chamber is essentially an online environment in which people just aren't exposed to alternative opinions besides their own. This usually happens just because the algorithms of how these social media platforms work is they just feed you the same stuff that you already watch and already know because you're more likely to click on it. And this starts to skew the content and sort of creates a bias towards information and facts and opinions on these platforms into basically one sort of perspective for the world, and all the opinions and values sort of get reinforced so that there's no actual alternative viewpoints. So your mind essentially just starts to look at the world from one particular perspective. A really good example of these is actually Twitter. And I just had to create a Twitter for this thing, as well as a bunch of other social media. I'll get in a second. But the thing is that Twitter, when you go on Twitter and you see like tweets or something like that, someone might like, I don't know, some influential person will tweet or something or vice versa. Well, typically speaking, you would only follow the people that you want to see tweets from, and they have a very particular opinion about something. And so when you follow people that all have the same sort of general opinion, or let's say one political opinion, or maybe a certain amount of facts or something like that, and then all the people that follow that person have the same particular opinion, then all the opinions are all getting thrown at you and they're all from the same perspective. So you never actually get the opposite perspective. What this essentially does is it skews reality. And I think we all saw this during COVID, where it's like all the people that had one particular viewpoint about the pandemic, they all got their news. And all the people that had another perspective, they got all their news. And it was like people were living in a particular world with different facts, different opinions, different beliefs. It's obviously been years since that happened. But I say this because this is exactly what I'm talking about, where the facts and opinions that come into these platforms, they just get reinforced. And so you never actually get any other alternative viewpoints. And so the ability to sort of make critical decisions and have rational thought within these platforms starts to skew, which starts to take a toll on our mind because we only look at the world in one way. And since we're talking about social media really quick, I have my own thoughts that I want to sort of give about a couple of them. One of them is definitely TikTok. I'm terrified of TikTok, and I want to make that very clear because TikTok is like, I don't know that it's good for us, because the fact that we're able to be fed such engaging content so quickly. So I had to create a TikTok. I'd never used TikTok before. And I know people that have, like everybody else was using it. I was the last person that hadn't been using it. They're like my parents or whatever. And I had to create this account, and I have not watched the feed. I have not watched my TikTok feed because I don't want it to start recommending me stuff because I know I'm going to death scroll forever, right? And I noticed a lot of the patterns, essentially the first 2 seconds of the video, that's all they have to get your attention. They know you'll scroll to another video where the first 2 seconds of that video is engaging. So everybody creating content is forced to make the first 2 seconds, including me, of the video engaging because of how fast the attention span has sort of been deteriorated on there. The fact that you're able to make such a quick decision with no loading of any kind in the first 2 seconds, whether you want to stick around for that video, basically you're able to have like a constant force feed drip of dopamine, right? And even if the video you're watching isn't interesting, eventually you're going to scroll to a video that you like, right? And that is like not ideal because What this essentially does when you only watch like 1 to 2 seconds of a video and like decide whether you're going to watch it or not, your critical thinking isn't actually really getting used, or at least it's almost like Tinder in a sense, where you're just like, oh, okay. You're not actually, your desire to partake in like medium to long-term ramification critical thinking just disappears completely, right? This is why I stay on YouTube, because if I watch a video on YouTube and it's like, let's say 20, 40 minutes or something, I usually make the decision whether to stick around in like 5 minutes. And so because I'm constantly deciding if the consequences, the ramifications for watching this 40-minute video are going to have real world effects if I have other stuff I need to be doing. Whereas TikTok doesn't do that. There's really no ramifications. You can just turn your phone off if you're at work or something, or you can just go watch another video. And so the critical thinking that happens is so much less. The other thing I want to say is that any of those TikTok fact videos, they're like kind of the worst. Now, I'm only saying this because I'm referring to ones that like my wife has seen, because I've seen ones like she shows me. And it's essentially just like somebody basically saying, hey, are you sad? Well, you might have X disorder. Well, are you upset? You might have X disorder. And I don't really like that, because it's based on sort of like the trust me, bro, because like maybe they'll grab a screenshot from something, but like at the same time, those people aren't doctors. And even if they are a doctor, they're not your doctor. They're just a random doctor that says, well, people that have this problem tend to have this problem. It feels good when somebody basically says, hey, you know, all these things that seem to feel like they're what's wrong with you? Well, this is what it could be. And it's like, oh, that's kind of cathartic, right? I hate that entire equation. I don't think any kind of fact or any kind of research that's being presented to me in under 60 seconds, like I usually just kind of doubt it instantly. I would rather have some serious research done about the topic. I don't want to have somebody just kind of force feed me opinions or facts or something like that, because I'm like, oh, it's just based on, okay, trust me, bro. And I don't really feel good about that. There isn't enough resources on TikTok to hold that kind of information or to have discussion. There's no room or time for dissenting opinions. It's all just, here's the opinion, here's the fact, there you go, done in 60 seconds. For the time being, I do not plan on watching TikTok. I'm going to continue uploading to there because I do really like reaching out to people and showing them what this series is all about. But I don't really like it to begin with personally. The other one is Twitter, because I had to make a Twitter in order to do this. It definitely seems different than when I used it like 6-7 years ago, because I haven't used it in so long. It definitely seems a lot more polished in terms of just the way everything looks. I have no idea how the algorithm works and stuff like that, but it's definitely going to be interesting to see what happens with it going forward. All the social media that I created for this series is essentially just going to be shorts for the time being, because I don't really have anybody to engage with. But over time, I do plan on sort of shifting the content as that sort of happens and as those opportunities develop for me to do that. But for right now, it's just going to be shorts all over. Now, the other complex adaptive system that I want to talk about are political parties. Now, I want to say here, right before I get into this, that I'm specifically talking about parties, not individual opinions. I'm talking specifically about parties. And remember, within context of mind control. Now, I want to just drop a quick warning that we're going to get into some weeds politically. I want to just implore everybody to understand that I'm outside of like all of this stuff. I am not a Republican. I'm not a Democrat. I am not in any party. I don't listen to this stuff. I have not watched the news since, I don't know what, years, basically. Like COVID was the last time I listened to the news. I have not listened to anything in a long time. So what a political party actually is that it's a group that essentially just believes and agrees all the same socioeconomic policies and changes that our society needs as a whole. Now, the problem with that is that every one of these political parties, it doesn't even have to be the US, it could be any country, they almost always have a very rigorous black and white way of viewing the world. And in the US, the two major political parties are basically just opposites. So most Republicans and Democrats have very strong beliefs on things like marriage and taxes and free markets, religion and equality and stuff like that. But the critical thinking can very quickly get lost in the waves, right? Because once these parties start to intermingle with themselves, they start to look at the other person as the enemy. So here's a really good example. Let's say that you're a Republican and you're thinking openly about a topic like something like abortion, right? So you think to yourself, okay, here's the deal. So here's some logic for you. Due to modern imaging technology, we know that there are very rare instances where kids are going to be born permanently genetically damaged. And it's very rare. But we know that these cases occur, right? And we know that these kids are going to experience intense suffering their whole life. another thought is that an accidental pregnancy can be super crippling financially for many families in the country, right? And the child is going to be raised in poverty as a result of the parent's mistake. And that's going to have nothing to do with the kid. And there's also the rare instances in which the fate of the mother is in question, right? This can happen anytime during a pregnancy. These are some excellent, serious questions that a rational person would want to think, and they would want to bounce these ideas off of people, right? However, if somebody were to be a Republican with these opinions and try to go talk to a Republican about these questions, they would just get absolutely scorned for it. They would get absolutely shellacked on Twitter for it. Speaking of which, the other example I'll give is actually something that happened on Twitter. So on the Democratic side, you have somebody like J.K. Rowling. And you probably all know exactly what I'm going to talk about, but essentially I remember this happening like a year ago. J.K. Rowling on Twitter, essentially, so she's very, very fiercely feminist. And she's a very, very strong supporter of women's rights. And she was on Twitter and she started to make some very particularly strong comments about people that were transitioning from men to women, because she had very particular concerns about at what point do we define these gender roles, and at what point does the identity of these gender roles start to come into question. And she had very strong opinions about this on Twitter. She was absolutely destroyed by her own side for those opinions. And this is a really good example because she has critical opinions that she wants to have discussed. And she can't have those because the echo chambers that are on the internet don't allow for that. Everybody's all seeing the same kind of content. And when there's suddenly an opposing opinion, everybody just jumps on top of it and just puts the fire out with water. The takeaway I want to give here regarding politics in this particular area is that if you're in like a political environment in which critical thinking is questioned or not like an option, I would recommend potentially reconsidering your involvement if you are remotely concerned about your personal sense of identity in that regard. Because if you don't have the opportunity to critically think, that's a big problem. Specifically when it comes to things like mind control and manipulation. We're going to go ahead and get to the next topic, which is groupthink. So groupthink is a phenomenon in psychology and communication theory, and it occurs essentially when individuals of a group desire conformity, so we sacrifice conflicting or alternative opinions or beliefs to better benefit the whole, which results in dysfunction in the group. I'm going to go ahead and give a very basic example of this. I'm going to give you the job groupthink analogy, right? So you have a bunch of employees at a company, and they're concerned that they're going to be laid off from their job due to budget cuts. Well, because of this concern, their biggest goal is to avoid standing out as controversial or divisive. They then choose not to engage in critical discourse with others in the group, and over time, the group struggles to critically assess new ideas, which results in dysfunction in the company. Creative problem solving starts to become an issue, and the whole thing starts to really cave. Now, groupthink seems like it's just something where like, oh, it could just happen in a company, but it's actually happened in very, very big cases that are like billion-dollar cases all over the world throughout history, and I'm going to get into 4 of them, which I didn't even know involved groupthink at all. The first groupthink case is actually the attack on Pearl Harbor. So I did not know this, but in 1941, during World War II, there was actually overwhelming evidence suggesting that Japan was preparing an offensive in the Pacific Ocean. Now, we had intercepted telegrams from Japan that indicated that that was the case, and the U.S. government warned the troops stationed there to be prepared, but many of the warnings were actually totally dismissed by those aboard the island. You have to remember that we hadn't actually got involved in World War II yet. And it was still 1941. And so no country had actually declared war on the U.S. up to that point. Japan's war declaration happened essentially during the Pearl Harbor incident. Everybody aboard the island kept telling themselves and each other that Japan would never get involved. And if they did, we'd have backup and we'd obviously win it. And so there was like this kind of, everybody on the island was like, oh, it's fine. It's not going to happen. Like, it's cool. And everyone's like, oh, yeah, man, it's not going to be a big deal. And then, as we know, that is not what happened. There was not a lot of preparation that happened, and it wasn't any one person's fault. What happened? Had one person stood up and said, hey guys, maybe we should be prepared, things may have gone slightly differently, but that never ended up happening. The second case I want to give is also a military-based case, and it's actually the U.S. Bay of Pigs invasion. So if you don't know what happened in the U.S. Bay of Pigs invasion, it was an absolute foreign policy disaster. This was during the time Castro was in power in Cuba. So this would have been during the Cold War in 1961. In 1959, Fidel Castro had overthrown Cuba, and the CIA had serious concerns about Castro's dictatorships. So this was the precursor to the Cuban Missile Crisis. The CIA proposed a plan that would require both air and naval forces to invade Cuba and overthrow Castro. The mission was prepared and planned in 1960 by the CIA during the Eisenhower administration under his approval. Now, when Kennedy took office in 1961, the CIA explained the plan to Kennedy, and he uncritically just accepted the idea despite some of his political colleagues' criticisms. Now, on the 15th of April in 1961, we flew B-26 bombers over Cuba to overwhelm them. 2 days later, 1,500 troops invaded by boat. There came a point during the invasion where it was clear that the U.S. was losing. When the troops on the ground requested air support, President Kennedy chose not to provide support to those on the ground, despite it being the prerequisite for the mission's success. His reasoning for that was that the rest of the world had heard about our invasion by this point, and he was concerned that other nations would get involved if the U.S. continued. Kennedy had an overwhelming amount of support staff that at any time could have said that this is a terrible idea, that we have to go help those people on the ground. But not one person ever spoke up. Possibly, probably, most likely in fear for their jobs, or due to the assumption that Kennedy knew something that they didn't. Within 3 days, all of the 1,500 troops we sent had either been imprisoned or killed by the Cuban forces. Had one person spoken up, something might have changed, but everybody just accepted that we're going to do this. The third one I'm going to talk about is the Enron Arthur Andersen scandal. Now, I wasn't around for Enron. I was like a little kid in 2001, but Enron was an energy company that was based in Texas right before the turn of the century. Enron had the bright idea to use accounting loopholes and other secretive means to hide all its financial losses and debts, which eventually racked up to the billions. This fraudulent practice began after Jeffrey Skilling had been appointed CEO. The craziest part about this is what happened to Arthur Andersen as well. So Arthur Andersen was this enormous accounting firm back in the day and was Enron's choice for its accounting needs. It was a separate firm. This is where Enron outsourced its accounting. Enron had essentially pressured Arthur Andersen to cook its books and was a large player in how Enron had gotten away with fraud for so long. Now, as a result of the Enron scandal, Arthur Andersen was disbanded as well. But here's the groupthink question, right? Imagine the accountants and employees at Enron or Arthur Andersen if, at any point during the many years of fraudulent business practices, someone had stood up and said something to law enforcement, the entire scandal wouldn't have happened. Instead, the employees were complicit and continued the scandal all the way up until 2001, where they were eventually found out. Put yourself in their shoes, though, like, would you have cooked Enron's books? We can always say no. But remember that these were exceptionally successful firms at the time, like Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan Chase. Likely all of the employees spent their entire lives building their career to get there. And the social environment of these firms probably reinforced this. The last case of groupthink I want to get into, every single person knows, and it's the 2016 Donald Trump election. Now, I was in high school at the time, but everybody listening right now, this will come as no shock because every single person woke up confused. I wasn't super into politics as like a kid, but I do obviously remember all the memes and stuff. And the overwhelming evidence that we all saw as the American people was that Trump was never going to win. And so there was this constant reinforcement. Oh, no, he's never going to win. He's never going to win, right? And this, for whatever reason, was just reinforced in the media, news, society, online, everywhere. And this caused many people who would have voted for Hillary to choose not to vote at all, since it just felt like it was unnecessary and inconvenient. Because why would I go vote for Hillary when she's obviously just going to win, right? People said things like, there's no way Trump is going to win. He's been smeared too much by the media. Hillary's winning in the polls, so there's no way she could lose. And that's obviously not what happened. Now, all of these groupthink cases stem from the idea of not speaking out when the situation demands it. There is fortunately a communication theory as to why somebody wouldn't want to speak out in a group, and it's known as the spiral of silence. Now, this was proposed by Elizabeth Noel Newman in response to the 1980 presidential election between Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan. What the spiral of silence is best described with a numbers experiment, and I'll go ahead and give it to you right now. Suppose you were in a group of people of modest size, so around 20 people or more, like a classroom. Suppose that you were all shown 4 circles labeled A, B, C, and D, with A being the largest, B being the second largest, C being smaller, and then D being the smallest. You are then asked which circle is the smallest, and at the same time, everyone is supposed to answer out loud. You answer D, but to your surprise and discomfort, everyone else in the room calmly calls out circle B. Your immediate response would be to question everyone else because you're absolutely confident in your choice of circle D. However, the longer you choose not to say anything, the less likely you are to say anything at all. Picture a spiral in the shape of a funnel. Initially, you reside at the top with the rest of the group. However, as you wait to speak up, you begin to spiral down the funnel, and at the base of the funnel exists fear of isolation from the group. Suppose 5 or 6 more questions are asked of you regarding the circles. It is extremely challenging to picture speaking up by that point, given that people may not even remember their answer. And for you to stand up at that point might subject you to group scrutiny and isolation, which you subconsciously would want to avoid. In a groupthink setting, it can be argued that people are substantially less likely to speak up the longer a conflicting group consensus arises, and this is likely a potent factor why no one spoke up in the previous examples. So we're all done with groupthink. The last example of strange social phenomena, and fortunately this is a good laugh for everybody, is actually cases of mass hysteria. Mass hysteria is a social outbreak in which a group of many people experience similar unexplained symptoms. Now, while we don't fully understand how these social outbreaks occur, we do know that it likely results from the way our nervous system interacts with and interprets our social interactions. When we see people panicking, we're also more likely to panic ourselves. Now, many cases of mass hysteria remain just a total mystery, but some become explainable with some further research and evidence. And I'm just going to make a quick disclaimer here. Pretty much every single story for the rest of this entire episode is going to start to get kind of weird. These stories here, but also everything deeper. So you could kind of think of this as like a checkpoint for the episode. Let's go ahead and get into it. The first example of mass hysteria is going to be the Pokemon panic of 1997. Now, absolutely nobody has probably heard of this because I hadn't either, but the Pokemon panic of 1997 is one of the greatest and worst things I've ever heard of. In 1997, Season 1, Episode 38 of Pokemon aired in Japan on live TV. During this episode, Pikachu uses Thunderbolt to stop several missiles, which causes them to explode, right? Now, when this happens, the screen flashes from blue to red very quickly for around 2 to 3 seconds, right? This caused strange symptoms in thousands of children across Japan. Around 650 children were rushed to the hospital by ambulance, and 2 of the children were in the hospital for 2 weeks. Around 12,000 children were reported to have very mild symptoms like headache, dizziness, etc. Obviously, the panic exploded across Japan. The police questioned the anime producers, asking them if they knew what had happened. The Japanese Department of Health came together to figure out what had happened. TV Tokyo, which is the broadcasting station that aired the episode, banned it, in addition to setting future guidelines for broadcasts of a similar nature. And then the anime creators obviously didn't use photoepileptic strobe lights anymore. And just so you know, you can go find that episode online. And I watched it. I was fine, but maybe some of you wouldn't be. But can you imagine if like everybody's watching Pokemon and then everybody starts to panic because they don't understand like why their kids are like suddenly like passing out and in comas and stuff? Like that has to be terrifying in like the 90s. The second mass hysteria case I'm going to use, some of you may cringe, that's fine. It's actually the Charlie Challenge. So if you don't know what this is, I say this because there are some interesting things about this game I did not know that pertain to strange social phenomenon. That's why we're here, right? So in 2015, if you don't know somehow, there was a popular trend that started throughout the world, and it very quickly became outlawed and made illegal in several countries. So the game consists of 2 pencils that are placed on top of each other in a cross shape, and you do it in a way where the top pencil can still like rotate freely. And then you put this cross on top of a piece of paper with the words yes and no placed diagonally from each other. And essentially you ask, I guess, Charlie if he's there, and then the pencil will theoretically rotate like a Ouija board, and it's supposed to be all spooky and stuff, right? Now, the reason I bring this case up is because most of us look at that and think it was really stupid, okay? That was my case. However, in Colombia, 4 teenage girls were sent to the hospital after playing the game and were diagnosed with mass hysteria after being released. And additionally, in 2017, the East Libyan government banned the Charlie Charlie Challenge after connecting it to 6 successful self-exit strategies. That's all I'm going to say. I don't necessarily think the game is haunted. That's not why I bring it up. I bring it up because from a psychological perspective, we can experience heightened senses of alertness and susceptibility to suggestion given the proper environment, right? If people have a particular outcome they're looking for, they're more likely to react to that outcome. And if the outcome is something like perceived demons, then you get the picture. And as a Christian, this kind of particularly hits home for me as well. The last subject of mass hysteria I want to talk about is the TikTok Tourette's epidemic. Now, there's a good chance that some people are pretty sensitive to this, and so I'm not actually going to give necessarily my opinion. I'm just going to read what happened from a paper published to the National Library of Medicine in 2021. I'm probably going to skip around just a little bit to save you time, but you can find the paper for yourself if you're interested. Now, if you've never heard of this before, this is going to probably come as a shock to you, but this is why I said I don't like TikTok. I get that this is very niche and very rare, but this is very strange. So I'll go ahead and start reading. This is from the National Library of Medicine. This is a paper that was published a couple years ago. In several countries, currently we are facing a new type of mass sociogenic illness, MSI, that in contrast to all previously reported episodes of MSI is spread solely via social media and hence is not locally restricted. For this new type of MSI, we therefore suggest the more specific term, quote, mass social media-induced illness, MSMI. Hereby, we want to raise awareness of its global occurrence, since only correct diagnosis enables appropriate treatment and termination of symptoms. Recently, in several countries, including Germany, UK, USA, Denmark, France, and Canada, an increasing number of videos were released on social media platforms such as YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram, showing people who claim to be suffering from Tourette syndrome, a childhood-onset chronic combined motor and vocal tic disorder, while in fact most individuals had functional symptoms only resembling Tourette syndrome. On February 2019, only shortly before the first patient with MSMI presented in our clinic in May 2019, the German YouTube channel, and I'm apologizing for my pronunciation, it looks like it's Gewitter im Kopf, was launched by a 22-year-old man called Jan Zimmerman. Judging from the videos, he indeed suffers from a mild form of Tourette syndrome. On this YouTube channel, however, he shows a countless number of movements, vocalizations, words, phrases, and bizarre behaviors that he claims are tics, but are clearly functional in nature. Tourette's experts can clearly tell the difference since the majority of supposed tics are complex and stereotyped and mimic those symptoms that lay people typically associate with Tourette syndrome. For most of the shown symptoms, there are obviously strong situational contexts with exclamations of long sentences with insults, swear words, and obscenities that are in this form known in Tourette syndrome. Furthermore, the number of symptoms, and in particular the number of different swear words and insults presented, are countless, and thus far beyond those of tics in Tourette syndrome. Finally, presented symptoms quickly change on an almost weekly basis in parallel to newly released videos. Over the past 2 years, a remarkably high number of young patients have been referred to our specialized Tourette outpatient clinic presenting with symptoms closely resembling the ones Jan Zimmerman shows in his videos. All of these patients had been pre-diagnosed with Tourette syndrome, even partly as treatment-resistant Tourette syndrome after having had received pharmacotherapy with different drugs including antipsychotics. Remarkably, in none of these cases, neither the correct diagnosis of functional Tourette-like movement disorder had been made, nor the interrelation with and influence by social media had been recognized. Here we want to briefly summarize how in this group of patients, diagnosis of Tourette's-like FMD were confirmed. First, all patients presented with nearly identical movements and vocalizations that not only resemble Jan Zimmerman's symptoms, but are in part exactly the same, as well as bizarre and complex behaviors, such as throwing pens at school and dishes at home, and crushing eggs in the kitchen. Even more, similar to Jan Zimmerman, words and phrases are pronounced with a changed voice and low pitch so that family members are able to differentiate normal conversation from the supposed vocal tics solely on the basis of the tone of voice. Second, a substantial number of patients gave their supposed Tourette syndrome a name just as Jan Zimmerman does, who calls his symptoms Gisela. Third, patients often reported to be unable to perform unpleasant tasks because of their symptoms resulting in release from obligations at school and home, while symptoms temporarily completely disappear while conducting favorite activities. Fourth, in some patients, a rapid and complete remission occurred after exclusion of the diagnosis of Tourette syndrome. Although some patients did indeed suffer in addition from mild Tourette syndrome, for all newly emerged symptoms, it could be clearly ruled out that they were tics for several reasons. 1, the onset was abrupt instead of slow. 2, symptoms constantly deteriorated instead of the typical waxing and waning of tics. 3, simple movements like eye blinking and noises like clearing one's throat were clearly in the background or completely absent, although being the most common and typical symptoms in Tourette syndrome. 4, movements were mainly complex and stereotyped and predominantly located in the arms and body instead of the eyes and face. 5, overall, the number of different movements, noises, and words was countless, and far beyond the typical number of tics in Tourette syndrome. And 6, premonitory feelings were reported with atypical location, quality, and duration compared to tics in Tourette syndrome. Thus, worsening of pre-existing Tourette syndrome, for example, due to the COVID-19 pandemic as suggested elsewhere, can be clearly ruled out in our patients. So that's pretty crazy. Essentially, a bunch of kids ended up presenting to different clinics with what they believed to be Tourette syndrome, and it was like a huge thing that happened in like 2019 and 2020, and it was potentially brought on by social media. And I'm not even here to give an opinion about what I think. All I know is I don't really like TikTok. Obviously, there's more that goes into it than that, but if doctors are saying that this is a problem, I don't think there's anything I need to even add to that conversation. So we have now completed the second depth, which was strange social phenomenon. We are now going to start to move a little deeper. We are now moving to the third depth, which is the war for control. In the realm of mind control and manipulation, everything from this point onward is going to get a little bit more touchy because these cases of social hijacking, as we're going to talk about, they're all social. They have a direct purpose behind the hijacking, however benign or malicious. But from this point onward, there are no accidents. Everyone that is manipulated in these situations is manipulated on purpose. The 3 topics for this depth are mainstream media, psychological warfare, and totalitarian takeover. And as an added bonus, totalitarian takeover actually includes cults too, but we'll get into that in a few minutes. We're going to get started with mainstream media. Now, to say that mainstream media is manipulative would be just beating a dead horse. The thing is that I do have some insights from psychology and communication theory that I'd like to share with the world, and the 2 that I have for you here are cultivation theory and agenda setting theory. So in the 1960s, PhD in communication sciences George Gerbner started to become concerned about the amount of violence people were watching on TV. And for context here, Hitchcock's Psycho had came out in the year 1960 and had shocked audiences with its dark and innovative themes. But today, if you look back, you still don't see that much violence in that movie. It's absolutely nothing in comparison to something like Saw or Pulp Fiction, right? Now, Gerbner proposed a theory regarding how viewing media can alter the beliefs and values of the viewer over time. When applying his theory to a piece of media, there are 3 separate parts. The first is institutional process analysis. So why is this entity or institution producing this kind of media? What do they get out of it? Number 2, message system analysis. What message is this entity trying to communicate? And you have to remember, Gerbner was very concerned specifically about the portrayal of violence from both Hollywood and the mainstream media, and its effects on how we view the world. 3 is cultivation analysis. How might this content affect the viewer's beliefs and understanding of the real world? And you can take all 3 of these and apply them to something like Saw or Hostel or any kind of like very ultra-violent film. Gerbner also proposed his own interpretation of the word mainstreaming. This is separate from the definition that we're using for mainstream media. Mainstreaming is a blurring process which has 2 parts. The blurring of the line between the real world and the TV world, and then the homogenizing of the millions of heavy viewers into one cohesive group that views the world exactly the same with the same values. So Gerbner began studying the effects of people who heavily watched news regarding acts of violence across the nation, right? So essentially, they got a bunch of people together that all watched like people dying on TV and stuff, right? The whole 4 people were killed in Florida again type of thing, right? He also predicted that people that heavily watch the news in this way would be far more likely to view the world as depicted through the TV. Gerbner found some fascinating and concerning information when analyzing cultivation over an extended period. Here were his findings. Number 1, cultivation, no matter what form, always takes time. Number 2, cultivation studies completely depended on surveys instead of experiments because you can only ever ask people what their experience is. Number 3, most heavy viewers became increasingly afraid of becoming victims to criminal acts. The more they watched criminal stories on TV, the more likely they are to worry that they were next, which is incredibly interesting to me because I don't watch that kind of TV. But it's really fascinating to imagine that you're watching people dying on TV all the time and you start to worry, wait, I could be next, right? Number 4, Gerbner's subjects also viewed society's role in law enforcement to be exceptionally higher than it normally is. They believe that around 5 to 10% of people in this country contribute to hunting and capturing criminals, which is not true. 5 to 10% of people are not police officers. And then number 5, this is unsurprising, but there was a greater distrust in others and suspicion of others' motives. Now, critically, this whole cultivation theory makes sense, but there were some legitimate criticisms back then. Mainly, the scientific evidence backing this theory is challenging to prove because experiments with controlled trials are almost impossible to pull off. Critics argued cultivation theory's causality. This means that they believe that viewing the world as mean and scary could come from something else, and that watching heavy TV could just be an outcropping of larger problems. So it may not be them viewing the TV that makes them scared of criminals and being next. That could just be the result of something else going on in their own life. Regardless of where you may stand on the issue, these concerns did not disappear from the broad population. This gave rise to more research done on the topic in 1968 by Dr. Maxwell McCombs and Dr. Donald Lewis Shaw, who became the authors of the much more nefarious and well-researched agenda-setting theory. Now, going off what we previously just discussed with cultivation theory, agenda-setting theory describes the ability of the news media to influence the importance of the issues placed on the topics of the public agenda. Essentially, it works like this. It is accepted that all around the world, every day, thousands of newsworthy events likely occur. While the media only have 24 hours in a day to cover as much as they can, they do have full control over what news they choose to cover. The stories that the media do choose to cover sets an unconscious bias on the viewer towards the inherent importance of the stories they choose to cover. And a very easy example would be comparing any minor news story whatsoever to the insane 2020 news cycles. I bet at least one time in 2020, a drunk driver killed someone and got life in prison for their actions. Yet I never saw any media of that sort because the 2 biggest stories of the entire year were COVID and the 2020 election. Does this mean that the other story is any less valuable than those other stories? The media may want you to believe so. Agenda-setting theory was created by the aforementioned scientists McCombs and Shaw after their study in 1968 in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. They surveyed 100 regular viewers of the local TV and radio stations in town and asked them what they believed the most important election issue was, not what their beliefs were on that issue. They then cross-referenced that political issue with that of the local media and found an overwhelming overlap between the two. Now that we understand that the news media prioritizes stories in a way that directly shapes our understanding of the world, we can see exactly how they could leverage this in a way that creates a series of agendas or goals that they want to have met. For example, imagine the people that work at MSNBC. Imagine that all of them actually did their homework and came to the conclusion that climate change is extremely concerning and that it needs to be fixed very quickly. They could set a goal or an agenda of altering the public's perspective on climate change by prioritizing discussing climate change with experts and provide an astronomical amount of watch time to this kind of content, and the viewer would naturally assume that it's the most important issue that MSNBC should be reporting on. There are 3 public agendas that each media source directly influences and pushes with its content. A political agenda, which is the political goals held by those at the organization. a media agenda, which is the internal goals these news organizations have to generate ratings and profits and stuff, and then a public agenda, which is essentially just informing them of their role in fixing these problems. Agenda setting also directly influences a cognitive phenomenon involving our memory known as accessibility. Accessibility is the idea that the more we experience something, the easier it is for us to pull it from memory. This can make it hard to shake ideas that are repeated to us every day from the news media about the world. An excellent example wrapping up all of this is COVID. Regardless of your opinions and thoughts on this illness, regardless of any of that, it is irrefutable that the media would not stop covering it for a single second. I think they sometimes still do. I don't even look. I can attest that it was extremely difficult to shake thoughts of this illness for years because it was always at the forefront of my mind. Every news outlet in the world would not stop talking about it, so I felt like I could not escape it. I couldn't get away from these outlets just telling me to think about it and have opinions about it. So it would never escape the accessible area of my mind. Now let's go ahead and return back to the war for control. We're going to get into the next topic, which is psychological warfare. Now, psychological warfare is the study and process of capturing the mind, particularly in a military setting. This is going to be a pretty enormous segue because the next few topics are going to revolve specifically around the US government. We're going to see how many in Minecraft jokes I end up making. So now within psychological warfare, I have several topics I want to talk about. PSYOPs in the Korean War, the Firdos Square destruction, Operation Mockingbird, and then COINTELPRO. And if you have never heard of any of those, you may want to strap in because this is where things are going to start to get a lot more serious and extreme. Starting with the PSYOPs in the Korean War, in 1950, North Korea chose to invade South Korea. The United States and the UN scrambled together and began backing South Korea by instigating extreme Psy-war efforts on North Korea, right? Now, during the war, the US and the UN dropped billions of leaflets via plane all over the country. This was incredibly effective since it was in support of South Korea. It didn't affect them at all, and it likely even supported them since they knew we had their back. North Korea, on the other hand, was heavily affected by the propaganda. Think about it for a second. You're only invading South Korea because your communist dictator told you to. Why risk your life for a dictator that doesn't even respect you? You can actually find images of these leaflets very easily if you Google around for them. If you think about it, it's kind of crazy. And these leaflets are very obvious propaganda, whatever way you want to slice it. And in the 1950s, information traveled way slower than it does today. So it is without question that these leaflets affected the way the Korean soldiers interpreted both communism and the United States as a whole. Many of the leaflets depict communist leaders taking advantage of the Korean people. One like this shows a snake being depicted as a communist, picking up a farmer and making him spew into a bucket with a bunch of his crops. This leaflet was designed to influence farmers not to work with communist leaders. The United Nations was instrumental in the Korean War, so many of these leaflets depict surrendering to the UN as the safest strategy. One leaflet depicts a Korean man eating what looks like a bowl of rice sort of happily. The rice is all steamy and stuff, and the text at the bottom reads, "Why be hungry?" Korean soldiers had been enduring harsh cold weather and food shortages, and the implication from the UN was it was not worth it to die of starvation when you can just surrender and we will feed you. One other kind of leaflet depicted overwhelming force. One in particular shows a man with a machine gun with a big red target around him on the ground, looking up at the sky in horror. On the other side of the leaflet, it just shows a hole in the ground where the guy must have just been. These kinds of threats implied that, hey, North Korea, we're stronger than you and we're going to win and you can't contest us. Now, whether or not you think all these were silly, they most definitely worked. According to a paper from Christopher Lamb, it turns out that 98% of the 87,000 prisoners of war captured either possessed or had seen PSYOP leaflets that provided them with instructions on how to approach U.S. troops to surrender. 58% of the prisoners interviewed claimed to have heard coalition radio broadcasts, and 46% believed that the coalition broadcasts were truthful despite coming from their enemy. Again, some portion of the surrenders might have occurred even without PSYOP encouragement, but certainly there would appear to be a correlation between the PSYOPs and their compliance with those instructions. Now, PSYOPs are incredibly fascinating to study until we see them being used on us. The next one I want to talk about is the Firdos Square destruction. So in 2003, the United States began the deeply controversial invasion of Iraq. Now, the general consensus with the public after 9/11 was that we wanted to get the people responsible for the attack. Now, I was barely alive at that point. I was like 5 years old, right? 4 or something. But my understanding about everything today is that President Bush gave allegedly untrue information about the severity of the situation in Iraq and that we needed to invade to stop the perpetrators that caused 9/11. Now, the entire country became deeply split on whether going to war in Africa with a broken nation was a good idea. Regardless of what the American people thought, the American government wanted to convince the American people that this was a good idea. Now, as a result, some relatively unethical reporting happened during the war that has since come to light. And the big case I want to talk about today is the Firdos Square destruction. In April of 2003, several Iraqi civilians began attacking a statue of Hussein in Baghdad. Several reporters saw this, and nearby U.S. personnel got involved. They had the idea to topple the statue using an M88 tank by wrapping a chain around its neck and pulling it to the ground. This came to symbolize in the media the fall of Baghdad, and the image of this statue falling was globally publicized. The government and the media really wanted to convince the American people that invading was not only a good idea, but that we were winning. Not quite. Winning wasn't really an accurate word. We were just kind of there, occupying the foreign country. Regardless of whether or not that was the right decision, it was obviously unethical to pretend that we had any kind of upper hand. The actual events at Firdos Square were misconstrued by the media. As it turns out, the Iraqi civilians who were there were actually mortified when we had put the United States flag over the statue's face. They didn't want to be ruled by the United States. They just hated their dictator. They forced us to put up the Iraqi flag instead. Additionally, it wasn't an enormous crowd of people. Rather, it was much smaller, and to put it simply, it was hardly triumphant. This was just one attempt of many from the U.S. government to convince the American people that it was in the right. On the bright side, it could have absolutely been worse. Open propaganda is very easy to identify because it's right out there in the open. It's not like the CIA got involved in influencing public opinion or anything, except they have before extensively for decades. So that's the next one we're going to talk about. We're still at the depth of psychological warfare, but before we can continue, we need to talk about something that's going to be very relevant for the rest of this episode, which was the Church Committee. The Church Committee was formed by a very small handful of Republican and Democrat senators in 1975 and was specifically created to investigate abuses of power by the FBI, NSA, and CIA. What they found was shocking, like sick to your stomach shocking. And the next few topics that we're going to be discussing were all discovered by this committee. So thank God they did what they did. The Church Committee uncovered a variety of undercover operations, but for this episode, I'm just going to continue along the theme of mind control. The first topic we're going to be discussing is Operation Mockingbird. Now, solid information regarding Operation Mockingbird is very hard to find. I personally don't think it's enough to just say, ooh, spooky government conspiracies. I actually want hard evidence. I don't want to just kind of go off of hearsay for this kind of thing. Now, from what I can gather, Operation Mockingbird first gets its name from another CIA operation called Project Mockingbird, which does have extensive documentation and evidence backing it. Project Mockingbird was a covert espionage operation instigated by the CIA and President Kennedy to wiretap various forms of journalist communication to spy on them and seek out leaked government details and treacherous activity. Similar to Project Mockingbird, Operation Mockingbird is the alleged CIA program whose goal was to manipulate journalists into communicating CIA-influenced propaganda. The reason it's so challenging to find evidence on this is because while they are definitely hard facts, they don't combine into a narrative that the CIA has confirmed exists, unlike with Project Mockingbird. There is a document known as Family Jewels that does elaborate on and explain Project Mockingbird, but not Operation Mockingbird. What we do know is that the Church Committee published a report in 1976 showing that the CIA directly cultivated many relationships with the press, journalists, and private institutions. And in 1967, it was discovered that the National Student Association had been receiving funding from the CIA. It was essentially a series of student governments that took international trips and met with leaders of different countries to become educated and enact change. The CIA infiltrated and funded it so that they could get intel from different countries with a select few students as the unlikely agents. There are many instances of hearsay regarding this, but as many as 50 journalists and 400 press members had connections with the CIA. It's hard to pinpoint exactly what the CIA's goal was, since it has never been disclosed. We don't even fully know 100% of what happened or if it even exists. It would be far more terrifying to look into something that we do know exists. Enter COINTELPRO. If you do not know what COINTELPRO is, you are in for a wild ride. It is massive. COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program, was the astronomically scaled smear and espionage operation covertly run by the FBI from 1956 to 1971. This campaign's goal was to actively target any person, organization, or entity that the FBI deemed subversive and smear, tarnish, and warp public opinion of these entities. I don't know about you, but this stuff is the stuff they didn't teach me in school. Several important names come up when talking about the counterintelligence program. J. Edgar Hoover was the director of the FBI during the 1950s and 1960s and was responsible for developing and strategizing these obviously illegal and unethical operations. He was also instrumental in actually creating the FBI, as he was appointed to do so by President Calvin Coolidge in the 30s. From 1961 to 1964, John F. Kennedy was the president and Robert F. Kennedy was the attorney general. According to a book titled Enemies by Tim Weiner, John Kennedy knew about and helped orchestrate some of the more extreme movements that started at the time, particularly ones involving Martin Luther King Jr., who we'll get into in a minute. Before I continue, I want to emphasize that all of this information is publicly available. The document with all of this information is called Intelligence Activities and the Right of Americans, Book 2. It is the official report from the Church Committee as a result of its ongoing surveillance of internal government affairs. I'm going to read some sections of this letter, but before I do, consider a few things first. I want you to imagine justifying any of the extreme actions I'm going to describe. The values of the American people and the world at the time were obviously very different in the 1960s and 70s, but it's incredible what kind of indisputable values prevailed that we now mostly agree on as a society. And it's also equally incredible what lengths certain actors went to in order to prevent those beliefs from prevailing. Beliefs such as Martin Luther King was just and fought for a good cause, and freedom of one's own opinion. Lastly, how do we know these things aren't still happening? We don't. And we probably can't, not for a long time, if ever. All of these actions taken by these government actors were done with the single goal of maintaining a homogenous society without any extremes or outlying beliefs. That kind of society is devoid of critical thinking and doomed to fail. Let's begin. I'm going to start reading from the Church Committee Final Report, page 10. The FBI's COINTELPRO, counterintelligence program, was designed to disrupt groups and neutralize individuals deemed to be threats to domestic security. The FBI resorted to counterintelligence tactics in part because its chief officials believed that the existing law could not control the activities of certain dissident groups, and that court decisions had tied the hands of the intelligence community. Whatever opinion one holds about the policies of the targeted groups, many of the tactics employed by the FBI were indisputably degrading to a free society. COINTEL tactics included anonymously attacking the political beliefs of targets in order to induce their employers to fire them, anonymously mailing letters to the spouses of intelligence agents for the purposes of destroying their marriages, obtaining from IRS the tax returns of a target, and then attempting to provoke an IRS investigation for the express purpose of deterring a protest leader from attending the Democratic National Convention, falsely and anonymously labeling as government informants members of groups known to be violent, therefore exposing the falsely labeled member to expulsion or physical attack, pursuant to instructions to use, quote, misinformation to disrupt demonstrations, employing such means as broadcasting fake orders on the same citizens' band radio frequency used by demonstration marshals to attempt to control demonstrations, and duplicating and falsely filling out forms soliciting houses for persons coming to a demonstration, thereby causing long and useless journeys to locate these addresses, sending an anonymous letter to the leader of a Chicago street gang, described as violence-prone, stating that the Black Panthers were supposed to have, quote, a hideout for you. The letter was suggested because it, quote, may intensify animosity, and caused the street leader gang to, quote, take retaliatory action. 2. From late 1963 until his death in 1968, Martin Luther King was the target of an intensive campaign by the Federal Bureau of Investigation to, quote, neutralize him as an effective civil rights leader. In the words of the man in charge of the FBI's, quote, war against King, quote, no holds were barred. The FBI gathered information about Dr. King's plans and activities through an extensive surveillance program, employing nearly every intelligence gathering technique at the Bureau's disposal in order to obtain information about the private activities of Dr. King and his advisors to use to completely discredit them. The program to destroy Dr. King as the leader of the civil rights movement included efforts to discredit him with executive branch officials, congressional leaders, foreign heads of state, American ambassadors, churches, universities, and the press. Listen to this. The FBI mailed Dr. King a tape recording made from microphones hidden in his hotel rooms, which one agent testified was an attempt to destroy Dr. King's marriage. The tape recording was accompanied by a note which Dr. King and his advisors interpreted as threatening to release the tape recording unless Dr. King committed self-exit strategy. The extraordinary nature of the campaign to discredit Dr. King is evident from 2 documents. At the August 1963 March on Washington, Dr. King told the country of his dream that all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, I'm free at last. The Bureau's Domestic Intelligence Division concluded that this, quote, demagogic speech established Dr. King as, quote, the most dangerous and effective black leader in the country. Shortly afterwards, and within days after Dr. King was named Man of the Year by Time magazine, the FBI decided to, quote, take him off his pedestal, reduce him completely in influence, and select and promote its own candidate to assume the role of leadership of the black people. In early 1968, Bureau headquarters explained to the field that Dr. King must be destroyed because he was seen as a potential messiah who could unify and electrify the black nationalist movement. Indeed, to the FBI, he was a potential threat because he might abandon his supposed obedience to white liberal doctrines, which were nonviolence. In short, a nonviolent man was to be secretly attacked and destroyed as insurance against his abandoning nonviolence. Insane. By the way, we have the document, the letter that was sent to Martin Luther King. This letter was found in the desk of William C. Sullivan in 1975 during the government's largest investigation of the FBI. Now, while we don't know for certain if he wrote it, he has been cited as the alleged author. The letter reads as follows, and as I read this, I will likely replace a couple of words. This letter was written by the FBI to Martin Luther King. You will not believe this if you've never heard it, and this is the stuff they don't teach you in school. King, in view of your low-grade, abnormal personal behavior, I will not dignify your name with either a Mr. or a Reverend or a Doctor, and your last name calls to mind only the type of a king such as King Henry IV and his countless acts of adultery and immoral conduct lower than that of a beast. You know you are a complete fraud and a complete liability to all of us African Americans. White people in this country have enough frauds of their own, but I am sure they don't have one at this time that is anywhere near your equal. You are no clergyman and you know it. I repeat, you are a colossal fraud and an evil, vicious one at that. You could not believe in God and act as you do. Clearly, you don't believe in any personal moral principles. King, like all frauds, your end is approaching. You could have been our greatest leader. You, even at an early age, have turned out to be not a leader, but a dissolute, abnormal, moral imbecile. We will now have to depend on our older leaders like Wilkins, a man of character, and thank God we have others like him. But you are done. Your honorary decrees, your Nobel Prize, what a grim farce, and other rewards will not save you, King. I repeat, you are done. No person can overcome facts, not even a fraud like yourself. Lend your sexually psychotic ear to the enclosure. You will find yourself and in all your dirt, filth, evil, and moronic talk exposed on the record for all time. I repeat, no person can argue successfully against facts. You are finished. You will find on the record for all time your filthy, dirty, evil companions, males and females giving expression with you to your hideous abnormalities, and some of them to pretend to be ministers of the gospel. Satan could not do more. What incredible evilness. It is all there on the record. Your sexual orgies. Listen to yourself, you filthy, abnormal animal. You are on the record. You have been on the record. All your adulterous acts, your sexual orgies extending far into the past. This one is but a tiny sample. You will understand this. Yes, from your various evil playmates on the East Coast to Classified, and others on the West Coast and outside the country, you are on the record. King, you are done. The American public, the church organizations that have been helping Protestant Catholics and Jews, King, there is only one thing left for you to do. You know what it is. You have just 34 days in which to do it. This exact number has been selected for a specific reason. It has definite practical significance. You are done. There is but one way out for you. You better take it before your filthy, abnormal, fraudulent self is bared to the nation. Insane. This letter, which you can find online very easily, was sent to Martin Luther King along with a tape that had recorded audio of his hotel rooms that was secretly recorded, all by the FBI, with the express purpose of causing King to essentially self-off himself. And the reason I put such an emphasis on this is that the entire nation, or at least most people of the free world, look at Martin Luther King as a saint, as like a hero. So it's like incomprehensibly insane to imagine that there was this much effort put into something that we now all kind of like look at as being like we look at what he was doing as a good thing. So it makes you reflect on our government, and it makes you reflect on the bigger entities that are at play way up above us, that are in like the government and the FBI and all this different stuff, right? Not because I want to watch the news and find out what's going on, but because I cannot fathom what these people are doing today. If this is what they were doing 50, 60 years ago, I can't fathom how much worse it could have possibly gotten. I just can't imagine. In short, the FBI went to the extreme to demoralize King in the eyes of the public, the world, and in modern history, but collectively, we all view him as a martyr for what he believed, in virtually every way. And the critical consensus from 99% of the people is that his actions were necessary and justified in order to free the African American people, and that the world he wanted to see was just. COINTELPRO mentions discrediting him with, quote, executive branch officials, congressional leaders, foreign heads of state, American ambassadors, churches, universities, and the press. Like, imagine that. Imagine the media and the universities and the church saying all these things about you. Immoral things about King, in part due to the FBI's actions. Smear articles in the news and teachers telling their students that his actions and morals were in the wrong. Imagine going to school and the teachers in the universities are like, Martin Luther King guy, he's a bad guy. We don't want him standing up for these rights, these African Americans. Can you fathom that in the 60s? Also, here's a question. Were the people tipped by the FBI actually in on it, or were they just complicit? Maybe they just didn't trust or believe the FBI, but were just given no choice. And once those harmful ideas about Dr. King spread through the population, I wonder how many people said them, but didn't even know what to believe. Here's possibly the biggest question of all, right? What can we even believe? How do we even know that this isn't being done now by bad actors, anywhere with a specific purpose of manipulating and controlling our thoughts and behaviors? It's just something to keep in mind, right? Now, in these cases of psychological warfare and manipulation, where the critical thinking has already been done for us based on information we haven't actually seen ourselves, and the opinion is free for us to digest, alarm bells should start going off. Remember that old saying that if it's free, we're the product. Now, we're going to go ahead and back up to the war for control, and the last one we're going to talk about is totalitarian takeover. This one is a little bit more interesting and entertaining, in my opinion, because subtly controlling the public is one thing, but a complete totalitarian takeover is another. Now, while it's extremely tragic, there are many examples of top-down government mind control that we can look at throughout history so that we hopefully don't repeat it. Additionally, this kind of takeover has been widely repeated by cults, meaning we're going to be tackling totalitarian government. This kind of takeover has been widely repeated by cults, meaning we're going to be tackling totalitarian governments and cults at the same time. Now, there's a great book regarding this exact thing titled Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, written by psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton in 1961 as a response to the Chinese indoctrination tactics that had been utilized by the Chinese government during that time. The book outlines 8 criteria for thought reform, which are considered so effective that the criteria aren't just used for cults. Governments clearly have used them too. So I'm going to go ahead and give the 8 criteria for thought reform. And while these were listed by Lifton in this order, it doesn't necessarily mean that these steps are implemented in this order, although I cannot verify the validity of this. Just keep in mind that these are more all-encompassing as opposed to actually just being steps in a particular order. So I'm going to go ahead and give you the 8 criteria. But as I do this, I want you to consider if you feel like you've ever been in an environment in which these 8 have been used against you. Keep those in the back of your mind while I'm going through this. Number 1 is milieu control. Milieu control involves complete control of information and communication within the environment, as well as an individual level. This is done to isolate people from necessary information that could be used for critical thinking. Number 2 is mystical manipulation. This involves orchestrating experiences that may appear spontaneous, but were in fact planned by a leader or group in an organization. This paves the way for a false sense of spiritual validity with the leaders in the organization. This allows them to essentially say whatever they want, and the organization will believe them as a result of some kind of spiritual awakening or gift or whatever. Number 3 is the demand for purity. This involves developing a black and white view of the world, which is then used to extort those in the organization to conform to the right or good side. Use of guilt and shame are essential and effective. Side note, that's me. So I was very much raised with a black and white perspective, so that hits home for me. Number 4 is the confession. The organization develops its own definitions of sins and requires confessions of the sins publicly to the group. And sin doesn't necessarily mean the Christian view, it just has to do with something that someone does wrong, like a wrongdoing in the group. There is no confidentiality. Rather, the leaders publicly exploit and discuss organization members' wrongdoings out in the open for everyone to bear witness to. Side note as well, I've heard that this happens with Jehovah's Witnesses. I am not one of those. I never have been, but I feel my heart goes out to people that have had that happen to them before. Number 5 is sacred science. This involves developing unique ideology or doctrine considered to be the ultimate truth, beyond reproach or dispute, meaning it is not to be questioned. Seeking alternatives to this ultimate truth outside the group is not allowed. Additionally, the leader who creates and teaches this doctrine is also above reproach and criticism, as they are ordained or put in power by whatever higher power they place them there. Number 6 is loading the language. This is big. This involves creating or redefining words or phrases in such a way that the outside world cannot understand it. These words contain thought-terminating cliches that are then used to prevent organization members from critically thinking and instead conforming to those within the organization. Thought-terminating cliche examples include "everything happens for a reason" or "why? Because I said so." Instead of actually answering and critically assessing a question or thought, these sorts of phrases do the opposite and shut down and quell critical thought due to their circular logic. Number 7 is doctrine over person. This involves viewing all experiences a person has, self or otherwise, as within the sacred science, and casting out all other methods of viewing that experience. This is essentially what you could consider to be like a worldview shift, where your worldview has to fit within this sacred science. And finally, we're at number 8, dispensing of existence. This involves the organization's right to determine who exists and who doesn't. While not to be taken literally, It means the organization and or its leaders has the power to decide who gets to be in the organization and who doesn't, as well as formulating and instilling negative opinions on those outside the organization. This essentially cuts off everyone in the outside world unless they choose to join and conform, and it is the responsibility of the group or organization to reject those who reject it. Those are the 8, and I'm hoping that you're not feeling super uncomfortable, but there's a good chance that you are, because many of those are used in a lot of religions. This is one of the reasons why I wanted to do this episode, because, like I said, these hit very close to home with me. And so if anyone out there feels the same way, or they have some sense of discomfort about these, my heart goes out to you because I feel exactly the same way. There is, fortunately, a silver lining to all of this. We have finished Depth 3, which is the war for control. However, this means that we only have deeper to go, which is to depth number 4, Machiavellian minds. Now, this next depth describes a brief overview of specific psychological conditions that will cause people to behave in purposefully manipulative ways. And it will also investigate specific communication techniques and strategies people may use to manipulate others. At this depth, we're going to begin looking at things from an interpersonal, one-on-one basis, since up to this point, we've predominantly covered social phenomena at a macro scale. This can include any kind of interpersonal relationship. It could be romantic, familial, business, doctor, patient, teacher, student, whatever it is. If it's a one-on-one, that's what we're talking about here. This depth consists primarily of psychological disorders listed in the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition. The DSM-5 lists 3 different clusters of mental disorders, of which each are labeled A, B, and C. We're exclusively focusing on the 4 disorders from cluster B. And very quickly, I want to make it very clear, I am not a psychologist, I am not a social worker, I am not licensed in any of those regards, I'm not a therapist. So I am not making any diagnoses on anybody, and I implore everyone out there also not to make any diagnoses on anyone if you yourself are also not licensed. It is, however, beneficial to at least be educated on how certain people, specifically manipulators, function. Now, for all of these disorders, I'm going to be reading directly from that DSM-5 so that I can provide the most accurate definitions and descriptions of these disorders. The other thing we're going to be doing at this depth is going to be pulling in some of the stuff I was educated on, which is communication tactics. Pulling from communication theory, there are certain ways humans can be manipulated and exploited via their communication, and this section's basically going to be cybersecurity training for the human mind. If communication theory is something you're unfamiliar with, it is as wildly interesting as it is abstract, because the ways humans communicate aren't as easy to study and instantiate as psychology or science. I'm going to do my best to illustrate these theories to describe how they could be used against us. But first, we're going to go ahead and go back to our personality disorders from the DSM-5. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is start reading from the DSM-5, those sections that include those personality disorders that are typically characterized by manipulative behavior. These 4 disorders are narcissistic personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, histrionic personality disorder, and antisocial personality disorder. I'm going to go from the top to the bottom, and I'm going to go ahead and read certain sections, and I may skip around just for brevity. We're going to start with NPD. Narcissistic personality disorder is a pattern of grandiosity, need for admiration, and a lack of empathy per the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. This disorder is classified in the dimensional model of personality disorders. NPD is highly comorbid with other disorders in mental health. Persons with NPD can often present with impairment in maintaining work and relationships. NPD is highly prevalent in society, however, there has been limited research on the same. Given the limited research on the same and differences in the diagnosis of the disease, it was initially going to be discontinued from the DSM. NPD is under the umbrella of Cluster B personality disorders, which include antisocial, histrionic, and borderline personality disorder. Scrolling down a little bit, traits such as aggression, reduced tolerance to distress, and dysfunctional affect regulation is prominent in persons with NPD. Developmental experiences, negative in nature, being rejected as a child, and a fragile ego during early childhood may have contributed to the occurrence of NPD in adulthood. In contrast, excessive praise, including the belief that a child may have extraordinary abilities, may also lead to NPD. NPD includes a pervasive pattern of generosity, fantasy, or behavior, need for admiration, and with lack of empathy, beginning by early childhood as indicated by at least 5 of the following. Has a grandiose sense of self-importance, e.g. exaggerates achievements, expects to be recognized as superior without actually completing the achievements, is preoccupied with fantasies of success, power, brilliance, beauty, or perfect love, believes that they are special and can be only understood by or should only associate with other special people or institutions, requires excessive admiration, has a sense of entitlement, such as an unreasonable expectation of favorable treatment or compliance with his or her expectations, is exploitative and takes advantage of others to achieve their own ends, lacks empathy and is unwilling to identify with needs of others, is often envious of others or believes that others are envious of them, or shows arrogant, haughty behaviors and attitudes. The diagnosis of NPD, as other personality disorders, requires evaluation of long-term patterns of functioning. One needs to be cautious not to jump to hasty conclusions because NPD can trigger countertransference. A careful evaluation of the different aspects of a person's life and an understanding of the person's childhood development can assist in the evaluation and diagnosis of NPD. I'll go ahead and get into borderline next. Borderline personality disorder is characterized by hypersensitivity to rejection and resulting instability of interpersonal relationships, self-image, affect, and behavior. Borderline personality disorder causes significant impairment and distress and is associated with multiple medical and psychiatric comorbidities. Surveys have estimated the prevalence of borderline personality disorder to be 1.6% in the general population and 20% of the psychiatric inpatient population. Patients with borderline personality disorder have been shown to utilize extensive treatment resources and are at increased morbidity and mortality compared with the general population. This is perhaps the reason why borderline personality disorder has been studied more extensively than other personality disorders. Borderline personality disorder is multifactorial in etiology. There is a genetic predisposition. Twin studies performed in 2000 and 2008 both demonstrated higher concordance with the rate of borderline personality disorder for monozygotic versus dizygotic twins. Environmental factors that have been identified as contributing to the development of borderline personality disorder include primary childhood maltreatment, physical, sexual, or neglect, found in up to 70% of people with BPD, as well as maternal separation, poor maternal attachment, inappropriate family boundaries, parental substance abuse, and serious parental psychopathology. Scrolling down further, a careful history and physical examination should be performed before performing a comprehensive psychiatric assessment. There are structured diagnostic screening tools that are used to assess personality disorders and specifically borderline personality disorder. For example, the Zaneri rating scale for borderline personality disorder. This is the DSM-5's diagnostic criteria for borderline personality disorder. A pervasive pattern of instability of interpersonal relationships, of self-image and affects, as well as marked compulsivity beginning by early childhood and present in a variety of contexts as indicated by 5 or more of the following. Number 1, frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment. 2, a pattern of unstable and intense interpersonal relationships characterized by alternating between extremes of idealization and devaluation. 3, identity disturbance, markedly and persistently unstable self-image or sense of self. 4, impulsivity in at least 2 areas that are potentially self-damaging, for example, spending, substance abuse, reckless driving, sex, binge eating, etc. 5, affective instability is caused by a marked reactivity of mood. For example, intense episodic dysphoria, anxiety, or irritability, usually lasting a few hours and rarely more than a few days. 6, chronic feelings of emptiness. 7, inappropriate, intense anger or difficulty controlling anger. For example, frequent displays of temper, constant anger, recurrent physical fights. 8, transient paranoid ideation or severe dissociative symptoms. That was borderline personality disorder. I'm going to move on to histrionic. Histrionic personality disorder, or dramatic personality disorder, is a psychiatric disorder distinguished by a pattern of exaggerated emotionality and attention-seeking behaviors. Histrionic personality disorder falls within the cluster B of personality disorders, which we know. People with histrionic personality disorder may feel underappreciated or disregarded when they are not the center of attention. These people are typically the life of the party and have a larger-than-life presence. They may be vibrant, enchanting, overly seductive, or inappropriately sexual with most of the people they meet, even when they are not sexually attracted to them. People presenting with histrionic personality disorder may demonstrate rapidly shifting and shallow emotions that others may perceive as insincere. Physical appearance may be used to draw attention to oneself by wearing bright-colored clothing or revealing garments. Those with histrionic personality disorder may speak in a vague style that lacks in detail. Furthermore, they may be dramatic and extremely emotionally expressive, even embarrassing friends and family with public displays of emotions. They may be impressionable, gullible, suggestible, and easily influenced, especially by the people they admire. Additionally, they tend to consider relationships closer than they usually are. While it is unknown what explicitly causes histrionic personality disorder, it is likely a disorder that is multifactorial in its origin. Histrionic personality disorder probably develops as a conglomerate of both learned and inherited factors. One hypothesis is that histrionic personality disorder may develop as a result of trauma experienced during childhood. Children may endure their trauma by coping with their environment in ways that may ultimately lead to a personality disorder. Personality disorders in childhood may originate as an adaptation to cope with a traumatic situation or traumatic environment. Parenting styles may also influence the likelihood of developing a histrionic personality disorder. Parenting which lacks boundaries, that is overconsistent or inconsistent, may predispose children to develop histrionic personality disorder. Moreover, parents who role model dramatic, erratic, volatile, or inappropriate sexual behavior put their children at high risk for developing this personality disorder. Because histrionic personality disorder tends to run in families, there is some consideration that there is a genetic susceptibility for this disorder. As with many psychiatric disorders, having a family history of personality disorders, psychiatric illness, or substance use disorders is a risk factor for histrionic personality disorder. Per DSM-5 criteria, a diagnosis of a histrionic personality disorder requires a pervasive and ubiquitous pattern of constant attention-seeking behaviors and emotional dysregulation as outlined by specific manifestations. Diagnosis requires meeting 5 or more of the following criteria. 1. Uncomfortable when not in the center of attention. 2. Seductive or provocative behavior. 3. Shifting or shallow emotions. 4. Uses appearance to draw attention. 5. Impressionistic and vague speech. 6. Dramatic or exaggerated emotions. 7. Suggestible or easily influenced by others. Or 8. Considers relationships more intimate than they are. These patients take repression and dissociation as a significant form of defense mechanism. And the last one we're going to do is antisocial personality disorder. Antisocial personality disorder, ASPD, is a deeply ingrained and rigid dysfunctional thought process that focuses on social irresponsibility with exploitive, delinquent, and criminal behavior with no remorse. Disregard for and the violation of others' rights are common manifestations of this personality's disorder, which displays symptoms that include failure to conform to the law, inability to sustain consistent employment, deception, manipulation for personal gain, and incapacity to form stable relationships. Scrolling a little further, antisocial personality disorder is the only personality disorder that is not diagnosable in childhood. Before the age of 18, the patient must have been previously diagnosed with conduct disorder by the age of 15 to justify diagnostic criteria for ASPD. Many researchers and clinicians argue this diagnosis with concerns of significant overlap with other disorders, including psychopathy. However, others counter that psychopathy is simply a subtype of antisocial personality disorder with a more severe presentation. Although the precise etiology is unknown, both genetic and environmental factors have been found to play a role in the development of ASPD. Various studies in the past have shown differing estimations of heritability, ranging from 38% to 69%. Environmental factors that correlate to the development of antisocial personality disorder include adverse childhood experiences, both physical and sexual abuse, as well as neglect, along with childhood psychopathology. Other studies stress the importance of both shared and non-shared environmental factors, including both family dynamics and peer relations on the development of ASPD. Before performing a comprehensive psychiatric assessment of the patient, a careful history and physical examination is necessary. The DSM-5 diagnostic criteria for antisocial personality goes as follows. The DSM-5 a pervasive pattern of disregard for and violation of the rights of others since age 15 years, as indicated by 3 or more of the following. 1. Failure to conform to social norms concerning lawful behaviors, such as performing acts that are grounds for arrest. 2. Deceitfulness, repeated lying, use of aliases, or conning others for pleasure or personal profit. 3. Impulsivity or failure to plan. 4. Irritability and aggressiveness, often with physical fights or assaults. 5. Reckless disregard for the safety of self or others. 6. Consistent irresponsibility, failure to sustain consistent work behavior or honor monetary obligations. Or 7, lack of remorse, being indifferent to or rationalizing having hurt, mistreated, or stolen from other persons. The individual is at least 18 years old, evidence of conduct disorder typically with onset before age 15 years, and the occurrence of antisocial behavior is not exclusively during schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. So those personality disorders are the 4 cluster B. So those are the cluster B personality disorders that are in the DSM-5. The reason I wanted to read all 4 of them is because I wanted to give a broad overview as opposed to just being like, oh, hey, narcissism and antisocial personality and stuff. I wanted to really grab it from the DSM-5 because I'm somebody that really prefers the evidence as opposed to just hearsay here and there. I wanted the actual raw truth. Now that we've gone through all 4 of those personality disorders and what characterizes them, we're going to go ahead and get into some of my favorite stuff, which is communication theory, which essentially describes how human beings communicate. And then we're going to take those theories and reverse engineer them into ways that could essentially manipulate somebody. Now, these communication theories are actually not something I think most people have heard of, mostly because they're such a small aspect of like the way that the human being works. And people usually focus on things like psychology, right? But these are actually pretty jaw-dropping if you've never heard of them before. And what I've essentially done is taken 4 of the biggest and most vital and valuable communication theories, and I've broken them down in a way where I can effectively explain what they are, and then I explain how they could be used to manipulate somebody. This way we will have a very effective, broad range of understanding for what kind of people manipulate and how they manipulate. The 4 communication theories that we are going to be going over are social penetration theory, the elaboration likelihood model, interpersonal deception theory, and uncertainty reduction theory. If you've never heard of these before, I actually recommend not looking them up until I describe them because I don't want you to have it spoiled for yourself. They're pretty insane. We're going to start off with my personal favorite, which is social penetration theory. Personally, I think this one might be my favorite, but I'm not really sure. I do remember when I first heard about it, I was like absolutely terrified. And I'll tell you right now, I use this one all the time. Like I actively think about this when I'm talking to people. That's how effective this and the other theories actually are. So to start, social penetration theory was developed in 1973 by psychologists Irwin Atman and Dalmas Taylor. Social penetration theory, as well as most of the theories in communication, relies on a set of assumptions about the way humans communicate. These assumptions are always researched and have data to back them, despite occasionally appearing generalized. Social penetration theory relies on 4 basic assumptions. Number 1, human beings develop relationships from the outside in. You can visualize this assumption like layers of an onion, where you have the outermost layer, then a little deeper you have the personal layer, a little deeper you have goals, deeper you have political presuppositions, a little deeper are your religious, and at the very, very center is the core, which would be your deepest fears and fantasies. Funny enough, essentially, I made the podcast after this entire thing because essentially this entire thing is me talking at the deepest, most possible level. That is how deeply intertwined I sort of am with this theory and how effective I actually think it is when studying the way people talk. Presupposition 2 about this is that interpersonal relationships move across this onion in a predictable and systematic manner. While we can't know exactly where we will go next in a relationship, we can still have a general idea where the relationship is going. Number 3, as the relationship continues, it can move all over this onion, including depenetration, where someone we once knew can become complete and total strangers to us. And number 4, the big takeaway here is that we move across the onion exclusively via self-disclosure through reciprocity. This means that the only way relationships develop is if we disclose information about ourselves to another person, and additionally, we are the most likely to disclose information to others if they lead in that self-disclosure. Now, if you think about a human being in this way, where they're essentially like an onion, and we sort of take this perspective, it's very easy to see how someone could be manipulated on a date or in a relationship if we assume that we reciprocate self-disclosed information. For example, if a man on a date asks a woman, "I'm from California, where are you from?" The woman is very likely to reciprocate, saying, "I'm from New York," specifically because the man self-disclosed first. That kind of information where we're from, could be considered rude, but because this man disclosed where he was from, she was more likely to self-disclose the same information, even if the man was being covertly dishonest. This means that someone can dishonestly self-disclose information about themselves at any point in a relationship, and if it is found that they were not honest, we can feel lost and confused as to who we're even talking to. Additionally, we should be aware of what we're self-disclosing, because a manipulative person could use that information that we give them against us. Lastly, and unfortunately this is from experience, manipulative people almost always want to have an edge over other people so that they can manipulate them. In this way, they are less likely to self-disclose true information. And additionally, they are substantially less likely to reciprocate information because they want to have an edge over the other person, and disclosing specific information has the potential to remove that edge. So if you're in a relationship with someone and when you self-disclose, you notice that they don't disclose to you, especially nearly at that reciprocal level, that's something that you should keep out for as a red flag. The next communication theory is the elaboration likelihood model. The elaboration likelihood model was created by psychologists Richard E. Petty and John Cacioppo in 1980. This one is a little more abstract than the last, but it's equally as crazy and important. The elaboration likelihood model is a flowchart that describes how our attitudes change via persuasion and how persuasion is ultimately achieved. Specifically, our likelihood to elaborate, carefully and critically think about a decision. For example, suppose you have a friend that wants to persuade you to go to the movies tonight. When you start to think about whether or not you should go, there are two distinct routes of thought that you can take, which I'll describe now. Number one is the central route, which involves high motivation and heavy cognition. Decisions made via this route are usually made in confidence and long-lasting. For example, one might be persuaded by assessing how much the movie tickets and food will cost, by budgeting, critically assessing one's schedule to see if the movie will fit in with it, and deciding thoroughly on a good movie to see based on critical reviews. If the person is highly motivated to solve these cognitive problems, persuasion will likely be achieved via this route. Also, they are likely to be confident in their decision since they have critically elaborated on it. Alternatively, we have Route 2, the peripheral route, which is nearly the opposite, characterized by low motivation to solve problems and a strong attention to uncritical allure. Decisions made via this route are usually made without much thought, therefore confidence in them tends to wane very quickly. For example, one might be persuaded to go to the movies to avoid chores or homework, or they really want to see a particular movie and aren't interested in considering other obligations. They may also throw caution to the wind and disregard a budget entirely. Then, once the decision's been made, the person realizes how much they're spending and that they have other responsibilities they're avoiding, which can lead to a lack of confidence in the decision that they made. With this in mind, here are some potential ideas for how someone could be taken advantage of. If somebody wanted to manipulatively persuade you into doing something or believing something, and they had a pretty good knowledge of who you were as a person, here are some ideas how that could manifest. If someone knew you pretty well and wanted to persuade you, let's say, to do something illegal, they could persuade you down the peripheral route by saying things that subvert critical thinking. Some examples could include, it's fine, it'll be real quick, right? Like, I don't know, let's say someone that you know wants you to rob a gas station or something. They're like, it's fine, it'll be quick. You're my friend, right? This is what friends do, isn't it? No one's going to worry about it. No one's ever going to find out what we did. Deep down, you really want to do this. You know you do, right? If they repeatedly say phrases like this, they can wear down your critical thinking and motivation to elaborate on the situation until eventually you either walk away from the conversation or cave. Alternatively, someone else could do the opposite and overload the central route, causing you to want to take the peripheral route. For example, if someone in an argument wanted to convince you that they were right, they could persuade you down the central route by giving you all sorts of facts, data, and logic. And if you were not motivated to critically elaborate those ideas, you might just do the same thing as before and either end the conversation because it's becoming uncomfortable or cave. The biggest piece of information to learn about the elaboration likelihood model is to be very aware of someone who's trying to subvert or overload critical thinking and motivation to be persuaded. The third theory we're going to talk about is interpersonal deception theory. IDT was proposed by philosopher David Buhler and communications professor Judy Burgoon in 1996. This theory aims to describe on a subconscious level how people handle deception during in-person conversation. This applies to both the deceptors and the receivers. This theory, instead of being a complex visual diagram, is simply a series of propositions that can be replicated and instantiated over many deceptive interactions. As such, I don't really need to describe how someone could be manipulated using this theory because the theory itself describes what happens to us during manipulation. So these are the different potential interactions. 1. What deceivers and respondents think and do varies according to the amount of interactive give and take that's possible in the situation. 2. What deceivers and respondents think and do varies to how well they know and like each other. 3. Deceivers make more strategic moves and leak more nonverbal cues, like visible deception, than truth tellers. 4. With increased interaction, deceivers make more strategic moves and display less leakage. 5. Deceivers and respondents' expectation for honesty, truth bias, is positively linked with interactivity and relational warmth. 6. Deceivers' fear of being caught and the strategic activity that goes with that fear are lower when the truth bias is high and vice versa. The more honest everyone is, the less afraid the deceiver will be. Number 7, motivation affects strategic activity and leakage. People who deceive for their own self-gain will make more strategic moves and display more leakage. The way respondents first react depends on the relative importance of the relationship and their initial suspicion. Number 8, as relational familiarity increases, deceivers become more afraid of detection, make more strategic moves, and display more leakage. Number 9, skilled deceivers appear more believable because they make more strategic moves and display less leakage than unskilled deceivers. Number 10, a deceiver's perceived credibility is positively linked to interactivity, the respondent's truth bias, and the deceiver's communication skill, but does go down to the extent that the deceiver's communication is unexpected. Number 11, a respondent's accuracy in spotting deception goes down when interactivity, the respondent's truth bias, and the deceiver's communication skill go up. Detection is positively linked to the respondent's listening skills, relational familiarity, and the degree to which the deceiver's communication is unexpected. 12, respondents' suspicion is apparent in their strategic activity and leakage. 13, deceivers spot suspicion when it's present. Perception of suspicion increases when a respondent's behavior is unexpected. Any respondent reactions that signal disbelief, doubt, or the need for more information increase the deceiver's perception of suspicion. 14, real or imagined suspicion increases deceiver's strategic activity and leakage. 15, the way deception and suspicion are displayed within a given interaction changes over time. 16, in deceptive interactions, reciprocity is the most typical pattern of adaptive response. 17, when the conversation is over, the respondent's detection accuracy, judgment of deceiver credibility, and truth bias depend on the deceiver's final strategic moves and leakage, as well as the respondent's listening skills and remaining suspicion. And finally, 18, when the conversation is over, the deceiver's judgment of success depends on the respondent's final reaction and the deceiver's perception of lasting suspicion. Now, lastly, I want to go ahead and do uncertainty reduction theory, which is quite a lot, but at the same time, it's a lot easier to digest. This theory was developed by Charles Berger and Richard Calabrese in 1975. Uncertainty reduction theory aims to describe and predict the motivations someone has for engaging in communication in the first place. It predominantly applies to the very first interaction people have with one another, but it can also apply in interpersonal relationships at any time as well. First, there are 7 assumptions required for uncertainty reduction theory. 1. In interpersonal environments, people experience uncertainty. 2. This uncertainty is considered uncomfortable and creates cognitive stress. 3. When strangers meet, they are immediately concerned with either reducing their uncertainty or increasing predictability. 4. Interpersonal communication develops through stages. 5. Uncertainty reduction is achieved primarily through interpersonal communication. 6. The amount and substance of information shared interpersonally can change over time. And 7, people's behavior can be very reliably predicted. Next, there are 3 potential reasons why people would choose to reduce their uncertainty. Number 1, we will see them again. 2, they have something we want. Or 3, they act or behave in a manner that deviates from the expected standards, which produces uncertainty. Lastly, when we try to gather information from other people, there are a series of axioms that we do so on. Think of these axioms like volume or brightness sliders on your phone or laptop. They are measures of highness and lowness in a total of 8 different categories. Number 1, verbal communication. So as verbal communication increases, uncertainty decreases. Number 2, nonverbal expressiveness and warmth. As nonverbal approval and affirmation increases, uncertainty decreases. Number 3, information seeking. When we meet someone, we usually ask lots of questions. Once we have the information we want, our information seeking behavior decreases and uncertainty decreases as well. 4, communication intimacy level. As our uncertainty of the person decreases, our communication intimacy level increases. Number 5, reciprocity. The more uncertain we are of someone, the higher we are to reciprocate communication and behavior. Once we understand them better and our uncertainty drops, we are less likely to reciprocate. Imagine mirroring someone's sitting posture during a job interview. Number 6, similarity. As similarities are discovered, uncertainty decreases. Number 7, liking. As our uncertainty of a person increases, our liking of them decreases. And lastly, number 8, shared networks. If we share communication networks with someone we've just met, like finding out your new boss knows people that you also know, our uncertainty decreases. Now, while that's a ton of information, there's a ton of good stuff to consider when it comes to manipulation tactics. When we first meet a manipulative person, it is likely they're looking to get something from us, although that definitely depends. If we in turn don't need or want something from them and instead only view them as deviant, or we know we will see them again, we could open ourselves up to being taken advantage of, as our motivations for reducing uncertainty are so vastly different, and in fact, their motivations could be morally compromised. Number 2, when we're in an interpersonal relationship with a manipulative person, they are likely to create uncertainty as a means to have an edge over us. This uncertainty can then be extremely difficult to navigate, almost like a maze, because it is intentional and orchestrated. When we try to reduce uncertainty with them, they either dismiss our attempts or outright lie to create a false sense of certainty. The other very important thing to consider is that their uncertainty reduction remains the same. They are still interested in exploiting or getting something out of us, creating what can feel like a skewed playing field where whenever we try to reduce uncertainty with them, it feels impossible. But when they try to reduce uncertainty with us, they are extremely persistent. And finally, manipulative people are more likely to provide just enough honest certainty for us to continue the relationship. If we literally don't know anything at all about someone and they know everything about us, we are obviously inclined to leave. But if we can continue to be exploited, the manipulator may choose to give small bits of truthful information so as to keep us on the field, but never holding the ball. And as a lot of you may have guessed, a lot of this has been my experience, which is why I'm even doing this particular topic. And speaking of which, that is everything from Depth 4 Machiavellian Minds. Now, I do have some bad news for everyone. Unfortunately, there are way worse examples of mind control that I'm going to get into next in our final depth, number 5, Evil Plays God. We are at the absolute bottom. There is no lower than this, not that's publicly accessible or widely known anyways. This depth includes only several cases in which a single person's mind is held hostage by one or more people in a direct way, with the express goal of altering their logic, emotions, and critical thinking. This can either be done for the overt purpose of evil or to study the effects of mind control on humans, which to be honest is also evil and unethical. These phenomena are the most disturbing because these people likely experienced irreversible damage to their psyche. In fact, we know that they did. These phenomena and stories involve extreme cases of psychological torture and human experimentation. And honestly, as like a side note, I was really nervous researching these because I felt like I was looking at documents and information that like I never should have been given access to. But it's out there because the internet's a pretty cool place sometimes. So this is the last warning I'm going to give everybody. Everything below this level is absolutely insane and extreme, and it is not for the faint of heart. Anything that has to do with mind control in the worst possible way you can imagine is here. So strap yourselves in. Now, there are two subtopics within this category that I want to get into. The first one is trauma, and the second one is human experimentation. We're going to start with trauma. These are cases in which someone is kidnapped, held hostage, and brainwashed directly or indirectly in a way that caused irreversible damage to their psyche. And before we get into this, I want to give a foreword on trauma bonding and Stockholm Syndrome. We're going to start this depth off with several cases of severe Stockholm Syndrome, which I'll explain in a minute. And the reason I want to do this is twofold. Obviously, the kidnappers of these victims had the express purpose of mentally manipulating and controlling the victims we're going to describe. But on top of that, the human mind is very fragile. That much is going to be very clear soon. And if it has to break in order to survive, it likely will. And such is the case with these victims who were never the same again. So let's do a quick overview of Stockholm Syndrome and where the name actually comes from. So Stockholm Syndrome comes from a 1973 bank robbery that happened in Stockholm, Sweden. Career criminal Jan-Erik Olsson held up a bank that was at the city square for several days, taking 4 people hostage inside the bank's vault. Now, there are reports that the hostages inside were acting strangely, cooperating with Olsson and defending him during police interrogations. However, evidence supporting that this strange behavior was the explicit result of being held hostage has been debated and questioned for decades. Now, I'm not here to weigh in on that debate. However, what I will say is that the heist only went on for 5 days before the police drilled into the safe and used tear gas to end the standoff. Imagine if that had gone on instead for years. Imagine what would start to happen to the mind. The change over that incredibly long span of time is what we usually talk about when we describe Stockholm Syndrome. The change over that incredibly long span of time is usually what we talk about when we describe Stockholm Syndrome, despite the fact that the actual event only lasted a few days. It's more of an observation than anything. To make all of this easier, we're going to define the cases I want to talk about instead as trauma bonding, which we know is a legitimate studied element of psychology. Trauma bonding is something that can happen to the human mind when people go through extreme stresses in life, maybe as like a couple or as a family or something. People can be drawn together through that trauma. The problem is that the same trauma can be exploited by captors of hostages, and they will subject them to cyclical reinforcement of abusive and rewarding behavior. Trauma bonding is a deeply damaging form of psychological torture in which a captive or a hostage will be subjected to cyclical reinforcement of abusive and rewarding behavior. In these cases, the kidnapper will enact evil on the victim in question, then allow them to go eat or go to the bathroom, or even see their family. This slowly whittles the mind down to a point where the victim can only do what the kidnapper says. The first case of trauma that we're going to talk about is what happened to Patty Hearst. Patty Hearst was born in 1954 to William Randolph Hearst, a career politician and owner of multiple media news outlets. She was kidnapped in 1974 by the far-left organization known as the Symbionese Liberation Army, or the SLA. She was kidnapped because she was an easy and potential political target, seeing as her father was incredibly wealthy and politically connected. According to her testimony, she was blindfolded, had her hands bound, and was thrown into a closet for a week. The entire time, she was told she was going to die by the SLA founder, Donald DeFreeze. Now, after several weeks, they began to let her out of the closet while blindfolded and allowed her to eat and participate in the political meetings. But she could not see any of her kidnappers the entire time. They would even give her SLA political tracts and a flashlight to read while in the closet, but would blindfold her every time she left it. After nearly 2 months, the SLA decided to ask her if she wanted to be let go or if she would fight with them. She chose to join their movement, and in her own words, she, quote, aligned her thoughts with theirs. They then took the blindfold off, and she was able to see her captors for the first time. She then began participating in political meetings and activities. She also chose to change her name to Tanya. Her lawyer also stated that during this time, she was sexually assaulted by several members of the SLA, including DeFreeze, under the guise of, quote, needing to understand sexual freedom. There's actually footage online of this that's been saved for historical purposes, and you can see her holding an M1 carbine during the robbery. Once she was seen at the bank robbery, Patty was instantly marked as a fugitive. Over the next year and a half, she would assist in other extreme criminal behavior, and depending on the witness testimony, she was either very kind and interpersonal or rude and jarring, depending on the crime. She was eventually caught by authorities in September of 1975, and psychologists immediately noticed that she behaved differently. Her IQ had dropped from 130 to 112, and she only weighed 87 pounds. She also had huge gaps in her memory from before the kidnapping occurred. Unfortunately, Patty was sentenced to up to 35 years in prison for the bank robbery and some of her other involvement in SLA activities. But she was let out after 22 months by Jimmy Carter under very strict probation. President Bill Clinton pardoned her entirely in January of 2001, and at the time of this recording, she's actually still alive, aged 68. When I think about this case in particular, I try to put myself in her shoes because it doesn't sound like a very tragic story until we start imagining that happening to us. For example, imagine just being kidnapped, being held in that closet blindfolded for weeks. Eventually, you hope that your dad, who's extremely wealthy and connected, will rescue you, but he doesn't. You're trapped in that closet and threatened with death every single day. It's not obvious to me what I would even do in that situation, but my mind would definitely begin to break down. Speaking from experience, I know what it's like to feel like you can't leave. That's all I'll say about it. It makes sense how eventually the mind actually traps itself to survive. So even after going out in public, it still feels like you're trapped. Additionally, imagine how demoralizing it would feel. Personally, I've thought it was my fault, and thus I'd feel so angry and ashamed that the only way out of that shame was to take the route given to me by these awful people. I completely understand how someone could be broken down and manipulated in doing things like this. The good news, though, despite everything, is that Patty is still alive and well, despite an undoubtedly extremely rough life. The same, unfortunately, cannot be said for the other people of this depth. In fact, quite the opposite. The second case of trauma that we're going to talk about is what happened to Colleen Stan. This is a very infamous case, and a lot of people have talked about this. There's movies and documentaries that have been made about this. It's really, really disturbing stuff. In May of 1977, 20-year-old Colleen Stan was hitchhiking in Oregon to a friend's birthday party when a blue van pulled over offering her a ride. Colleen noticed a man, woman, and baby in the van, so she felt comfortable getting in. Later, they let her out at a quick rest stop, and she felt the uncontrollable urge to run away and never go back. But she was still halfway to her friend's birthday party, so she reluctantly chose to get in the van with them. As soon as she got in the car, the driver, Cameron Hooker, and his wife, Janice Hooker, drove to a secluded place in the woods, put a knife to her throat, and forced her into a wooden box that prevented light, fresh air, and sound from entering. They then took her back to the home, and for the next 7 years, Colleen Stan was brutally taken advantage of and tortured by the couple. Cameron and Janice's plan was initially to find a slave to replace the abusive activity that Cameron had been doing to Janice. Initially, this was only various levels of bondage and physical abuse, but this certainly changed. Every day for the first 8 months, Colleen was locked in the box under Cameron and Janice's bed for 23 hours a day with virtually no food, water, or air. She had to use a bedpan while in the box as well. When she was out of the box, she was forced to act out Cameron's heinous fantasies. Cameron is one of the most brutal, horribly corrupt monsters I have ever learned about. He told Colleen that there was an entity called the Company, and if Colleen were to ever escape, the Company would kill her and everyone she ever loved. He also believed that actual sex with Colleen would be a breach of his marriage with Janice. So instead of doing that normally, he used, let's say, various objects instead. Cameron and Janice had 2 children, one of which Janice gave birth to on the bed that Colleen was trapped under. Imagine a monster of that caliber actually procreating, raising children, or lack thereof. The complete moral vacancy therein. In January 1978, Colleen was forced to sign a contract that signed her into slavery for life. 4 years went by before eventually Colleen was allowed to do small tasks around the house for Cameron and Janice. This included watching their 2 children work outside in the yard and work around the house. Eventually, she was allowed to go on jogs and even visit her own family by 1981. She kept what was going on a secret, obviously, in fear of the company. Her parents thought she had joined some kind of strange cult because she had been gone for so long and behaved so strangely. She also wore handmade clothes. They didn't want to intrude on her life, but were relatively nervous. The very next day after visiting her parents, to keep the lie going, Cameron went with Colleen to meet her parents, posing as her boyfriend. On this day, her parents took a photo of them together. Imagine being so tortured that despite everything and being right in front of her parents, she still felt completely helpless to the situation. While it isn't my place, I wonder if she was trying to lie to protect herself and her family. Shortly after this encounter, Cameron decided that he had given Colleen too much freedom and decided to lock her back inside the box for another 3 years, again under the bed with very little food, water, or air. Tragically, Cameron and Janice's children began asking where Colleen went. And by that point, Colleen had only been given the name Kay by Cameron, so the children asked where Kay went. Cameron lied to them, saying that she had gone home, yet she was under their father's bed the entire time. She would only be let out when the children were in bed. Eventually, in 1983, she was allowed to leave again and reintroduced to those around her, including the children. For context, the children were now at least 5 years old, given that we know one was born in 1978 and the other was slightly older. Imagine leaving the box and seeing the children for the first time in 3 years, and they can now walk and talk somewhat. Surprisingly, she was able to get a job as a hotel maid. Around this time, she was able to get a job as a hotel maid. And while that might sound nice, the most concerning factor as to why was because Cameron wanted Colleen to become his second wife. This began Janice's transformation back to sanity. While we've mostly been talking about Colleen, Janice had been tormented by Cameron as well for years prior. This part is speculation from me, but it's likely a factor in why she was willing to let Cameron have someone else to take advantage of. Janice heavily relied on cognitive decoupling methods over the years to handle the traumatic nature of Cameron's abuse, even back to when they had first met. Given that Cameron had now elevated Colleen to a second wife status in his mind and now let her have a job and leave the house again, and Janice didn't want to continue this any longer, she had tried convincing Colleen that the company wasn't real, which Colleen had a hard time believing. When on her way back from work, Colleen started a habit of calling Cameron from a phone booth saying that she was going to leave him. To her surprise, the monster began crying, begging for her not to leave. She still didn't call the police once the entire time. After 3 long months of this, Janice finally chose to call the police on Cameron. After an extensive trial, he was sentenced to 104 years of prison for his actions and will be eligible for parole in 2030, although he will be extremely elderly by that point in his life. Colleen has since stated that her faith in God helped her survive the torment, and fortunately, she is still alive today at the age of 66 at the time of this recording. It's sometimes hard to even picture such evil in one's head, trying to fathom how and why someone would ever act so morally debased. Speaking from experience, it's a factor in why we become so lost as human beings when trapped in these situations. We ask questions like, is it my fault? Did I do something wrong? If so, how could I have been so foolish? If it isn't my fault, how could something this awful happen to me? Where do I even begin to look to get out of the situation? Who can I go to? Who is sane and who isn't? We're almost to the end, but there's one last thing we're missing. Colleen Stan's kidnapping and torture was horrific, but the one saving grace was that the horrible things that happened there were localized to a very small group of individuals. Our final case, and the bottom depth of this episode, concludes with none other than Project MKUltra. As I mentioned before, the other topic of this depth is human experimentation, and there is no better example of this than Project MKUltra. For those who are unaware of Project MKUltra's existence, this is going to come as one final, deeply disturbing wake-up call for who we should trust in this world. You'll recall earlier I mentioned that the Church Committee discovered illegal activity the FBI had undertaken to manipulate the public. Well, there were many other discoveries made during that time period, and in 1974, MKUltra was one of them. Project MKUltra was a CIA undercover operation that ran from 1953 to 1973, and it is massive. MKUltra's largest goal, among others, was to find a way to completely take over a human being's mind and replace it with someone else's. Mind control and manipulation in the most naive and literal sense. The CIA's decision to initiate MKUltra was largely in part due to evidence suggesting the Soviet Union was running its own experiments on mind control, in addition to seeing psychological warfare tactics be greatly successful in the Korean War. While there is certainly documentation on MKUltra, unfortunately, most of the documents detailing the project were destroyed, ironically, immediately following the Watergate scandal. The CIA was concerned shortly after that they would be investigated, so they shredded thousands of documents in a cover-up attempt. Fortunately, around 20,000 documents survived. There is an excellent follow-up resource about this topic for those interested called Poisoner in Chief, written by Stephen Kinzer, who's a New York Times correspondent. He did extensive research on the subject, and some of the content I mention here will be referenced from his book. Project MKUltra officially began in 1953 by the CIA and ran till at least 1973. The CIA asserts that the MKUltra experiments were permanently halted, but we technically can't know for sure. The objective was to continue human experiments that had begun in German and Japanese concentration camps during World War II. The CIA placed a man by the name of Dr. Sidney Gottlieb in charge of the project. Over the course of several decades, many experiments were ran that were designed to discover ways to reprogram the human mind. The CIA was mostly in pursuit of a truth serum, a wonder drug that would cause those dosed with it to be unable to resist telling the truth. This meant that a lot of MKUltra research went into finding this wonder drug, the primary contender being LSD and its effects on unwitting subjects. I'll get into those examples in a minute. Many of the experiments run during MKUltra were either complete failures or so successful that they are now used as psychological torture methods by the CIA as a way to break down a subject's mind. MKUltra is such a broad topic to talk about, given that it is linked to many other CIA initiatives during the time period. To keep things concise, I'm going to be reading through a single 399-page document that describes a timeline of MKUltra's experiments, or sub-projects. This document is available online due to both the Freedom of Information Act and the hard work of small online communities dedicated to making documents like this available. There were a total of 149 MKUltra sub-projects. Now, instead of going through every single sub-project, I'm only going to include notable sub-projects with enough declassified information to understand what exactly happened. This is the list of notable MKUltra sub-projects. We're going to start with sub-projects 7, 27, and 40. The work for these primarily focused on LSD and its effects on humans. Sub-project 7 in particular stands out as the first, among many, to question ethics. It contains the following quote: "One of the difficulties of determining explicitly the effect of the drug itself is that the subject and the observer are both conscious of the fact that an experiment is being performed. It is hoped that, in the next year, subjects on the classified, who are, quote, essentially normal from a psychiatric point of view, will be given unwitted doses of the drug for psychotherapeutic purposes. In this way, more valuable experiments will probably be carried out in spite of hospital conditions. It is not known whether unwitting, in this case, meant fully unwitting or unwitting as to timing. It is also unknown whether unwitting doses were actually given." Sub-Project 7's emphasis included research on LSD's effects on disturbance of memory, discrediting by aberrant behavior, alternation of sex patterns, eliciting of information, suggestibility, and creation of dependence. Sub-Project 13 is where you will begin to see a narrative develop. The objective was solely to, quote, establish a petty cash fund at agency activity at Fort Detrick, Maryland. The purpose and use of the fund was 1. To support activities where unusual security considerations make it difficult to get financial support for more customary sources, that is, where proper funds for a given activity will require an undesirable amount or written or oral justification, and 2. To support the purchase of certain material where use of other funds would delay operations to an excessive extent. The most unusual expense was the rental of a car in Florida, December 1954, and a cabin rental in West Virginia in June of 1955. Subproject 18 was a plan to purchase an astronomical amount of LSD from classified. We don't know. As it turns out, this project was overseen by a man named Cornelius Roosevelt. Yes, the grandson of President Roosevelt, although Eisenhower was president during this time until 1961. Still crazy, though. Cornelius Roosevelt's approval is also on nearly every one of the documents I've seen because, spoiler alert, he worked in the CIA for the majority of his career post-World War II. The rabbit hole really goes deep. They were approved for up to $400,000, which is a whopping $4.4 million adjusted for inflation, but they only ended up spending $1,337 instead, indicating that they didn't go through with the doses. The CIA used Eli Lilly, an enormous pharmaceutical company, as a cover-up for the trip and expenses. Eli Lilly is worth $332 billion today. Moving a little further in the document, Subproject 23 involved tests done on terminally ill cancer patients in exchange for paid hospital expenses. It was run and managed by a doctor named Charles Gesticker, and the CIA helped him cover up payment when reporting income taxes. This is a noteworthy memorandum from Subproject 23. Memorandum for the record of 25 August 1955 states it was necessary to test effects of certain chemical substances on human beings, that certain anticipated effects involved mental functions which precluded the use of mental defectives. The project engineer authorized contractor to pay the hospital expenses of certain persons suffering from incurable cancer for the privilege of studying the effects of these chemicals during the terminal illnesses. Total funds expended in this fashion amounted to $658, and the full value was received, which is estimated to be $7,400 after inflation. Subproject 34 describes hiring a magician named John Mulholland to, quote, prepare illustrations of techniques described in a manual he wrote under Projects 4 and 19, assisting in the classified, which involves the design of devices for covert delivery of materials and other miscellaneous services. He also prepared a paper on the magician's art and the covert communication of information, mind reading. He also advised on the surreptitious delivery of materials, deceptive movements, and actions to cover normally prohibited activities. He was also a consultant for the development of various forms of disguise and covert signaling systems. Subproject 39 took place at the Ionia State Hospital for the Criminally Insane in Ionia, Michigan, with the goal of experimenting on the inmates there. Objectives read, quote, to exploit the research potential represented by a group of 142 criminal sexual psychopaths confined at the Ionia State Hospital. The project proposed states, quote, it is thought that these persons have the same kind of motivation for withholding certain information that is comparable to operational interrogation situations in the field. Drugs, including LSD, were used openly and surreptitiously on criminally insane inmates, along with hypnosis as aids to interrogation. Subproject 42 is the first huge operation on unwitting or unknowing test subjects. The documents describing Subproject 42 are almost exclusively checks, receipts, and item inventories that are very strange. This is because Subproject 42 was exclusively an undercover accounting system for a separate operation known as Operation Midnight Climax. If you don't know what Operation Midnight Climax is, we're going to get into it for just a minute. Operation Midnight Climax was a massive undercover CIA operation that ran from 1954 to 1965. The goal was to do mind control tests on unwitting or unknowing subjects. The operation took place in both New York and in San Francisco, California. I could not find details on how many people were illegally tested on. but it was likely at least several hundred over the course of 11 years. I'm going to read the most pertinent document we have on the subject from MK Ultra director Sidney Gottlieb, talking specifically about Subproject 42, titled Accountability for Certain Expenditures. Quote, Subproject 42 was established in part to provide the agency with a facility for conducting experiments involving the covert administration of physiologically active materials to unwitting subjects. The facility was set up by providing Dr. Morgan Hall, pseudonym for a man named George H. White from the Bureau of Narcotics, with a safe house in San Francisco and furnishing him with the necessary materials and funds to carry out the approved program. Mr. Hall, in turn, carried out part of the program with the assistance of certain individuals who covertly administer this material to other people in accordance with his instructions. For their assistance with this program, these individuals are paid in small sums of cash at irregular intervals. Due to the highly unorthodox nature of these activities and the considerable risk incurred by these individuals, it is impossible to require that they provide a receipt for these payments or that they indicate the precise manner in which the funds were spent. These small expenditures by Mr. Hall will therefore appear as cash withdrawals from his account for which no receipt from the ultimate recipient will be required. Each of these operations will be reported up in detail to the Chief TSS Chemical Division and individually will bear his approval when Mr. Hall submits his monthly accounting. Signed, Sidney Gottlieb. So what was Operation Midnight Climax? Once these men were lured in, the CIA did a wide variety of tests on them and observed through one-way glass. These experiments include 1. Paying the prostitutes to drug these individuals with LSD to see how they respond. 2. Having the prostitutes use intimacy in addition to other drugs to see if a combination can make the subject more susceptible to disclosing information. And 3. Feeding subliminal messages to these individuals to see how likely they were to act them out, including criminal activity. A factor in why the operation was initially so successful is that no one on Earth would ever tell anyone that they were experimented on by the CIA. I mean, they wouldn't even know it was the CIA if they got drugged by LSD. They just wouldn't understand what happened. Not only would no one likely believe them, but they'd also risk public shame for their behavior if they came forward. So these people stayed quiet. Additionally, who would you trust if that happened to you? It's not like the government was going to do anything because it was the government doing it in the first place. Going back to our list of subprojects, we're going to move down to Subproject 43. This one's objective was to find a substance that could produce a hypnotic trance and or be made immune to one. The notes read, quote, This study was to perform research in the field of psychology of the dissociative states and of hypnosis. Research yielded promising leads in terms of knowledge of how hypnotizability can be influenced by pharmacological means. Several drugs, unspecified, were identified that were apparently effective in speeding the induction of hypnotic states and in deepening the trance that is produced in given subjects. Observations were also made of drugs, unspecified, that provide some degree of immunity to hypnotic influence. Testing on human subjects confirmed it is not stated in the file whether the subjects were volunteers or non-volunteers. Subproject 45 involves more experiments on terminally ill patients. The project involved the search for and preliminary testing of materials not mentioned, which might alter consciousness and have other physiological effects, alteration of blood pressure, cardiovascular responses, body temperature, or anti-cancer properties. The purpose was to identify and evaluate substances which might have application in the psychochemical and K knockout drops field. No comments indicating the results of the project were found. This is nuts. Quote, body fluid of seriously ill medical patients were screened for toxic substances and animal experiments on the effect of these toxic substances were conducted. After pharmacological and toxicity studies in animals, those active substances which were determined to be within a suitable toxicity range were to have been tested on appropriate patients after initial testing had been done on advanced cancer patients. No further information regarding this suggested human experimentation was found. The Gashticker Fund contributed around $600,000 to the project, which is an estimated $6.7 million after inflation. It is unknown if the research participants in the project were witting or not, but we do know that Dr. Gashticker and the National Institute of Health were both witting to do these human experiments. Now, on our subproject list, we're going to skip down to one final subproject, and that is Subproject 68. This one is the worst of the bunch, in my opinion. Fortunately, we do have extensive documentation of what happened. Subproject 68, like many others, wasn't directly funded from the CIA, rather secretive approved funding of research the CIA was interested in regarding mind control and brainwashing. This funding was through a CIA-owned shell company known as the Society for the Institute of Human Ecology for a Canadian university in Montreal, Quebec. The research was done by Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron, and this man performed some of the most terrifying psychological experiments on his test subjects, in addition to having some possibly questionable views on human society. I'm going to talk about Dr. Cameron first because it's a really important prerequisite to what he did to these people. In no particular order, during the 50s and 60s, for certain periods of time, Dr. Cameron was the president of the American Psychiatric Association, a member of the Canadian Psychiatric Association, a member of the American Psychopathological Association, and a member of the World Psychiatric Association. He wrote a book in 1948 titled Life is for Living, in which he demonstrated very strong opinions about Germans in the aftermath of World War II. He viewed mental illness and chronic anxiety as a social contagion that could be spread to others, which is actually a very fascinating take in and of itself given modern society. The huge problem was his way of describing the cure for this contagion. In a late 1940s lecture called Dangerous Men and Women, he described archetypal personalities of people that he deemed sick or weak. These 4 personality types were the passive type, the possessive type, the insecure type, and the psychopathic type. His solution for how to fix these people was to eliminate them or remove them from society, to keep the rest of society healthy, treating those with mental illness almost like lepers. Going back to Subproject 68, one of Dr. Cameron's areas of interest was with schizophrenic patients. He wanted to see if it was possible to reprogram his patients in 2 steps. First, erasing the current mind, and second, rebuilding the mind from the ground up. Unfortunately, in a deeply sad way, he solved the first problem, but never the second. His patients, I don't even want to call them that, but his patients who had previously suffered with schizophrenia, anxiety, and depression left with irreparable damage, including incontinence, amnesia, forgetting how to talk, and forgetting their parents. While he experimented with all sorts of psychological torture methods, the one he is the most famous for is now known as psychic driving. This is the process of looping a speech pattern on a recording over and over and over again for weeks and months at a time until the subject's mind breaks. He also used various forms of treatment methods. They're not really treatment, it's just torture, including electroconvulsive shock, sensory isolation, and LSD, of course, right? Additionally, he would frequently paralyze the people that he was experimenting on using a substance called curare, which is a naturally reoccurring paralysis agent. This means that if they wanted to fight back or stop, they couldn't. The torture he inflicted on these victims was unfortunately so effective that the CIA now uses it as one of their 2-stage methods of psychological torture. Having had explained all that, I'm going to briefly wrap this up by just reading the notes for Subproject 68. Objective: to study the effect upon human behavior of the repetition of verbal signals. Patients selected were those suffering from extremely long-term and intractable psychoneurotic conditions. They were treated with LSD-25 and other similar agents to break down ongoing patterns of behavior. The plan included intensive repetition, 16 hours a day for 6 or 7 days of prearranged verbal signals. Patient is kept in partial sensory isolation, then continuous sleep for 7 to 10 days. Lasting behavioral changes of 2 months' duration were achieved in one case. An April 23, 1959 memorandum for the record states that Dr. Cameron completed over 100 cases with some rather dramatic results, particularly with neurotics. There is no indication in the file as to whether the patients were witting, and as one can assume, I do not believe so. So that is it. That is everything. There is no deeper. We have reached the end. And while I'm sure everybody is disturbed and frustrated and concerned and scared and disappointed, we do need a light at the end of the tunnel. something that gives us hope despite all of this. So what are some of the simplest, most important takeaways that we can gather from all of this? What we know is that the human mind is exceedingly adaptable. It will adapt to survive when the situation demands it. This means that our minds are incredibly malleable, but they can also be equally resilient. There are people in this world that look at other human beings as just a means to an end, and they will use people in order to get what they want. And while we do understand a lot about how the mind works, there's a lot that we do not understand. This means that we must be careful who we trust. Now, I have responses that I want to give regarding every single one of the depths that we've covered. Responding to evil plays God, the most important thing to remember is that there are very, very few people in this world that would ever behave in this way and do something so sinister to someone else. The chances and odds that something happens to you or to me or to anyone in this situation is astronomically low. People are not getting kidnapped off the street and having their minds controlled. It's very, very rare. But it's also a testament to how far we can fall and how badly our minds can be destroyed if we're not careful. Responding to Machiavellian minds, in short-term relationships with people that you meet briefly, the biggest thing to watch out for is pathological lying. If people don't know you, they can lie to get you to give them the information that they need so that they can use it against you. If something seems like a red flag, trust your gut. It probably is. In long-term relationships, remember that manipulative people need to know you to manipulate you. Be aware of what details you self-disclose and be aware of a lack of self-disclosure or an unusual pattern of self-disclosure from the other person. Remember to trust your gut. Responding to the war for control, the greatest defense against group-instigated mind control is individuality. Nameless and faceless organizations that offer you a particular worldview or belief system may be doing it for their benefit. You're you. You don't need to believe what they say about yourself and the world unless you choose to. Remember the age-old saying, if it's free, you're the product. Responding to strange social phenomena, if you're in a group setting and you notice that the other people are behaving strangely, or you feel like you need to mold yourself to fit in with the group, keep an eye on that. Stepping out of line or standing up for what you believe in may come with a cost, but so does sacrificing your individuality for the group. So it's up to you to decide what you're willing to pay to be in that situation if you're stuck in it. And responding to the power of suggestion, at the end of the day, the greatest and most powerful piece of advice is awareness. People are manipulated and controlled every day, and they either don't know that it's happening or they don't know when it started and how to escape it. If you are aware of who you are and what you believe, and you build boundaries around those beliefs so that others cannot alter them or take them from you, you are on the right path. Now, this has been a very long and arduous journey, but I hope you were able to leave feeling like you benefited from the experience. I want you all to know that you are stronger than you think, and you are also now equipped to handle more than you anticipate. If you are struggling in any way with any of the topics we've discussed here today and feel like you need help to rebuild boundaries that have been broken or rebuild your sense of self, go seek that help. Find a licensed social worker or therapist that can help put everything back where it belongs. I chose to do this episode first because I went through a lot of reprogramming over the past 3 years, and I'm in the process of rebuilding now. So a lot of the themes from here are going to pop up again going forward. And in the future, what I intend to discuss will be much lighter on the facts and history and lean more into the stories, emotions, and experiences I've had and how those have affected me. I'll also have other people that I know give their experiences in a similar way with the hope of providing insight and wisdom that we can all benefit and learn from. For now, I am Leviathan, and I will see you again very soon.